Chapter 3019. At this moment, the essence of the seventh tribulation powerhouse was clearly not in the outside world. Similarly, it was not in the deepest world either. His current location was in one of the 363 world layers. Moreover, it wasn't fixed and unmoving. Instead, it randomly appeared in the layers of worlds, changing and changing. It was like a fish that could shuttle through the worlds. If it was an ordinary cultivator, it would definitely be difficult to grasp this essence at this time, and it was naturally impossible to comprehend this essence. However, the situation was completely different for Luo Fan. To him, this essence couldn't escape his senses at all. Even if its position was constantly changing and the world was changing, he could still grasp every detail of this essence extremely clearly. No matter how great the change was, no matter how illusory the change was to him, it was just constantly changing the position of his heart. At this moment, he added the traces of thinking that belonged to the owner of this essence that he had comprehended from the little girl onto those traces of essence. At this moment, Luo Fan's way of comprehending this essence was to send his countless incarnations into the endless stars that evolved inside the essence. At this moment, when this method of thinking was inserted into the strand of essence, it instantly caused the endless stars within the strand of essence to undergo a huge change. In just an instant, the originally randomly distributed endless stars began to split apart. An indescribably complex order appeared among the endless stars, as if there was an invisible brush sketching in the universe. With this change, Luo Fan felt that a large portion of the incarnations that he had integrated into the many stars had unknowingly gathered on the same star. Of course, not all of the incarnations gathered on the same star, but a large number of incarnations were gathered on a large number of stars. This was like the countless drops of water that were scattered evenly on the ground. But due to some strange change, they began to gather into low-lying areas, turning the originally wet flat ground into potholes. This situation obviously greatly reduced the target of Luo Fan's exploration. It could be said that to a certain extent, it had already reduced Luo Fan's focus. However, it was only a small part of it. If he wanted to truly lock onto one of them, if he wanted to completely lock onto all of the middle-aged woman's memories, all of her cultivation paths, and all of her profound concepts, it was clearly far from enough. After all, there were still hundreds of millions of targets that he needed to explore. It was obviously not an easy task to extract the only target he wanted from such a huge exploration target. However, this was still a great harvest. With such progress, Luo Fan was already quite satisfied. His clone began to interact with the many stars. Through this interaction, the secrets of the seventh tribulation expert hidden in the stars began to be revealed. He could vaguely feel an indescribable feeling from it. While the many incarnations in the essence began to gradually extract the secrets of the seventh tribulation powerhouse in a world on the surface of the island. Or rather, in the first level, the little girl had already obtained the information she wanted. In general, she had already determined the direction of her cultivation and the direction of her exploration. As an existence that had once constructed an island, although the island she had constructed was completely different from the island that Luo Fan had constructed with 365 layers of nested worlds, it was still an island in the end. She was quite clear about the fundamental structure of the island, and this clarity made her even more clear about the direction she should work towards in order to transcend the island. The ultimate goal of transcending an island was to leave the island, and that was to head outwards. However, to achieve this ultimate goal, it was not as simple as being stubborn and constantly rushing outwards. It was not like leaving the planet. If one wanted to transcend an island, the first thing they had to do was to deepen their understanding of the island. Only by having a clear understanding of all the laws of the island, all the mysteries of its structure, and all the principles of confinement would they have a chance to transcend this island. Therefore, if one wanted to transcend this island, the direction of exploration was not to head outwards, but to head inwards. If one explored outwards in the end, they would only obtain superficial knowledge. No matter what they did, they would not be able to truly understand the confinement essence of this island, and naturally, it would be difficult for them to transcend. However, if one looked inwards, the situation would be completely different. By continuously exploring inwards, one would be getting closer to the various essences of this island, and among them, the confinement essence was naturally one of them. In this case, when one explored to the end, one would naturally be able to truly come into contact with the confinement essence. Once one came into contact with the confinement essence, one would naturally want to break free from this confinement with just a thought. The little girl was very clear about this point. With regards to this island, it was obvious that if one wanted to explore the essence of this island, they would naturally have to venture deep into this island. They would have to venture deep into the world behind the surface of this island and explore the second, third, and even innumerable layers of worlds that might exist. As she strangely understood this world's cultivation system and cultivation route, the obstacles in her way were clearly broken. After that, in a short period of time she advanced, her strength began to rise bit by bit. When she left this city and arrived at a valley that seemed to contain a clue to the cryptic world according to legend, her strength had surprisingly risen by a few levels. Originally, she was only at the itinerant immortal realm, but she had risen to the innate grand luo realm. Such an extent of improvement was an unbelievable improvement to ordinary living beings in this world, and it was an abnormal improvement that was absolutely impossible to appear under normal circumstances. However, to a 7 tribulation expert, or even a 6 tribulation expert, such an improvement was extremely normal. It could even be said that if it wasn't for the deep profundities of this island being hidden in the layers of worlds, after she figured out the cultivation route of this world and manifested her cultivation, the improvement she obtained would not have stopped at this level. Innate grand luo realm cultivators were obviously no longer ants in this world. The appearance of any one of such existences would definitely cause a huge reaction in the cultivation world of this world. After all, the strongest cultivators in the cultivation world of this world were merely demi-saint realm cultivators. In terms of realms, demi-saint realm existences were actually only one realm stronger than innate grand luo realm cultivators. Although the difference between the realms of demi-saint realm was so great that it was comparable to the difference between an ordinary living being and an early-stage demi-saint realm cultivator. At this moment, an unfamiliar innate grand luo realm cultivator had appeared in this world, and she had even directly arrived at the valley that contained the deeper and more central part of this world. How could this not attract attention? Therefore, when the little girl arrived at this place, there were already several innate grand luo realm cultivators blocking her way in front of the valley. These innate grand luo realm cultivators looked at the little girl in front of them cautiously. They did not care about her harmless appearance at all, and all of them were facing her true nature as an old monster. One of the women immediately asked, "Fellow Taoist, where did you come from?" The little girl looked at these innate grand luo realm cultivators and sensed the faintly discernible demi-saint perception that lingered around her. She frowned slightly. It was at this moment that she knew that she had underestimated this world. She originally thought that the cultivators in this world wouldn't have much of a reaction to her appearance. After all, she hadn't been in this world for a long time, and she didn't have any conflicts of interest with them. At most, she was just passing by this world. Under such circumstances, they shouldn't have any hostility towards him, and they shouldn't care much about his existence. However, she did not expect that at this moment they would actually stand in front of her and block her way, just because she showed some abnormalities. "I just want to borrow a path to leave. Please don't stop me." Faced with this unexpected situation, the little girl forcefully suppressed the pressure in her heart and said, "Leave? This isn't the direction to leave." The female innate grand luo realm cultivator who spoke to the little girl looked at the little girl even more cautiously at this moment. At this moment, the demi-saint perception that lingered around them became more and more solid. Clearly, these demi-saints were even more vigilant towards the little girl at this moment. "Why are all of you so vigilant?" The little girl looked at the void with an inexplicable tone. She looked towards the direction where the demi-saint dog's perception came from. At this moment, she had already sensed that something was wrong with the situation. The demi-saint's reactions were simply too great. Normally speaking, she was only displaying the strength of an innate grand Luo realm cultivator. Compared to ordinary cultivators, her strength was already rather impressive, and it was already considered extremely extraordinary in this world. However, compared to a demi-saint expert, this was nothing, right? Logically speaking, a quasi-saint could easily crush a connate grand Luo with a flick of his finger. In fact, he didn't even need to lift a finger to completely suppress a connate grand Luo. How could a quasi-saint possibly feel wary? Moreover, even if they were wary, they should be able to make a move right now, right? Why were they still only vigilant and paying attention to this place? What exactly did they know? What were they wary of? In fact, what were they afraid of? With all these thoughts in mind, she naturally had no interest in continuing to tangle with those innate grand Luo realm cultivators. At this moment, as soon as the little girl asked that question, those innate grand Luo realm cultivators began to retreat rapidly, turning into rays of light that vanished into the distance. Meanwhile, the demi-saints who were just paying attention and keeping their guard up against something began to feel their senses strengthen madly. In the end, huge figures appeared out of thin air in front of her. They were terrifying experts who emanated an aura so powerful that even time and space seemed unable to withstand their pressure. Of course, they were only so powerful in the eyes of this world. In the eyes of the little girl, they were nothing. No matter how strong she was just a sage-to-be, not even a pseudo-sage-to-be. If she was in good condition, she would not even need to think about it. Just the counterforce caused by these sage-to-be's vigilance towards her would be enough to kill them without a burial place. As expected, a heavenly demon has appeared. A figure spoke at this moment. The voice was so loud that it was as if the entire world was speaking. The incredible commotion shook the entire world, causing the little girl to feel as if her entire body was being crushed by an endless and terrifying pressure. It was the rejection of heaven and earth, and the hostility of the world. Heavenly demon. The little girl was extremely shocked when she heard that. This world had actually predicted her existence a long time ago, and directly identified her as a so-called heavenly demon. This had clearly exceeded her imagination. Of course, she quickly figured out everything. After thinking about it, the root of all this could only be the creator of this island and this world, Luo Fan. Are you the one who's manipulating all of this? If that's the case, the bet isn't fair. An inexplicable anger surged from the bottom of her heart. One must know that the bet between her and Luo Fan was whether she could transcend this island. In this case, her enemy was obviously this island. Although the source was Luo Fan, the extremely powerful Seventh Tribulation powerhouse, no matter what, it was only his creation. This was obviously different from confronting Luo Fan and his Seventh Tribulation powerhouse directly. However, if Luo Fan was still interfering behind the scenes and manipulating everything on this island, then what was the difference between her and confronting Luo Fan and fighting with Luo Fan directly? In this case, her enemy was not just this island, but Luo Fan, the Seventh Tribulation powerhouse. Was there any need for such a bet to continue? The previous confrontation had already proved that she was much weaker than Luo Fan. Genius 1 Second Remember website. Mobile version. Chapter 3020. Driven by the rage in her heart, the little girl's body began to swell. Her aura that was originally at the innate grand Luo realm rose by 1,000 times in an instant, instantly surpassing the quasi-saint realm and reaching the pseudo-saint realm. However, in contrast to this increase in strength, her body underwent other changes at the same time. An indescribable feeling of illusory gradually appeared on her body. It was as if the entire world was denying her existence. Originally, this was what the little girl wanted to avoid at all costs. However, at this moment, the little girl was no longer in the mood to care about such changes. At this moment, all of her attention was focused on the rage in her heart. In other words, It was focused on Luo Fan, who was behind this island and this world. Of course, at this time, even if she burst out with her strength to maintain the authenticity of her body, she still couldn't break through this world. Naturally, she couldn't find Luo Fan outside of this world, or rather, outside of this island. At this moment, all she could touch were the powerful quasi-saints in front of her. At this moment, the powerful quasi-saints in front of her felt as if they had returned to the beginning of their cultivation. It was as if they were facing a powerful cultivator with an incomparably weak body. The feeling of being reduced to ants caused their expressions to turn extremely ugly. At this moment, the little girl's rage made her instinctively unleash her powerful strength. She suddenly raised her hand, and in an instant, the quasi-saints felt their bodies being penetrated and exploded by an extremely terrifying force. The clones that appeared here immediately exploded and turned into countless fragments and dust. It did not take long for them to vanish without a trace. Even at this point, the little girl still didn't stop moving. Her strength directly traced the connection between the clones and their true bodies and directly appeared where the true bodies of the quasi-saints were, crushing down on their true bodies. In just an instant, shrill cries of agony rang out from the sacred dojos that were extremely mysterious and profound to ordinary cultivators in this world. Soon after, the entire world began to tremble slightly. The sky turned blood red, and even rain that resembled blood fell from the sky and covered the entire world. There were even ghostly wails and howls that echoed throughout the world as if the world was weeping. This was the sign of the death of the most powerful person in this world. Of course, not all worlds would have such a reaction when a most powerful person in this world died. However, this world clearly had such a reaction. Of course, this performance wasn't purely due to the world's preference for the strongest. To the world, cultivators above the innate Grand Luo realm were obviously extremely important. They could be said to be the ladder of the world's evolution and the path of the world's sublimation. Under such circumstances, the death of such a being was naturally a great loss to the world. After suffering such a loss, it was naturally normal for the world to react and show some unusual phenomena. An indescribable malice began to gather towards where she was. Blood-red clouds appeared in the sky, becoming thicker and thicker. The blood-red color became more and more intense. Come on, since you don't care about fairness anymore, then make it more obvious. The little girl roared angrily, and the power in her body rose crazily. Pseudo-Saint first stage, Pseudo-Saint second stage, Pseudo-Saint eighth stage, Pseudo-Saint ninth stage. In the end, in just a few breaths, he had already broken through the shackles of the Pseudo-Saint stage and directly stepped into the Pseudo-Saint stage. The moment she stepped into the false Saint stage, the entire world shook violently. The tremors were even more obvious from the outside. It felt as if the entire island was shaking violently, as if there was an astonishing behemoth struggling inside, trying to break through the shackles of the island, but was unable to do so at all. Along with this change, the little girl felt her body gradually lose feeling. The first to lose feeling were his fingers and toes, then his palms and soles, then his wrists and ankles. This change was like a bucket of cold water being poured over her head, causing the little girl's mind to clear up. Immediately after, she reacted. If this continued, she would completely integrate into this island and be completely refined by this island. That would be a fate that was not any better than her essence, falling into Luo Fan's hands. No matter how he cheats, I can't let him get what he wants. This thought appeared in her mind at this moment. With a thought, she made a prompt decision to leave behind the last bit of clarity in her body. Then, she completely detonated all her power, and cultivation. Boom, 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 boom. An earth-shattering explosion erupted from the little girl's body at this moment, and an incredible shockwave continuously spread out in all directions from where she was. At this moment, the laws of the entire world were stirred into chaos. Even time itself seemed to be unable to withstand this terrifying impact. Endless folds appeared and the entire world became distorted. Behind this distortion, the shadow of another world appeared indistinctly. It was a world that looked quite similar to this world, but there were many differences. That world was a little weaker than this one in terms of reality, but it was only by an insignificant little bit. The blood-colored clouds in the sky began to boil continuously at this moment. It was as if there was an incredible amount of heat constantly pouring into the clouds, causing the temperature of the clouds to rise to the boiling point. At this moment, the malice of the world rose to a level where it was almost tangible. Vaguely, there seemed to be countless ghostly figures appearing in all directions, rushing towards the core of the shockwave. However, these ghostly figures could not resist the shockwave at all. Before the shockwave, they were completely torn apart in an instant and could not even last for a moment. However, in the face of such a tragic outcome, the ghostly figures, or rather, the malice of the world, did not waver. No matter how many were destroyed, they did not waver. They were constantly being produced and gathering towards the core of the explosion. At this moment, at the core of the explosion, there was a subtle spiritual light that took advantage of the shockwave and rushed towards the phantom world that appeared after the world was distorted. Clearly, it wanted to take this opportunity to step into that world. Although the illusory image of this world appeared after the folds of the world, the degree of reality of the illusory world was completely different in different positions. Among them, the most realistic location was none other than a valley not far away. 1. The valley that was rumored to contain clues to the cryptic world. This subtle spiritual light was none other than a little bit of the little girl's consciousness, or rather, a little bit of her life essence. At the very least, it was a little bit of the life essence of this incarnation. It was also the most important existence of this incarnation that the little girl deliberately preserved after detonating everything in her incarnation, even though it seemed like she would rather die than let Luo Fan obtain any benefits as a 7 Tribulation powerhouse. Her will was extremely firm. Even in the most impossible situation, she still wanted to preserve the last bit of hope. This bit of life essence was the bit of hope that she wanted to preserve. The target of this hope was clearly the deeper world. Only by entering the deeper world could she get closer to the essence of this island, and then find a way to transcend this island. At this moment, there was even an indescribable excitement surging in her heart. Even if you cheated, I'll still obtain victory using normal methods. This was the source of the excitement that surfaced in her heart. At this moment, the spiritual light directly rushed into the valley, rushing towards the core of the valley, which was also the most realistic location. Immediately after, it began to tremble, continuously charging towards the most realistic location. This kind of impact was naturally not the kind that ordinary living beings thought of. Instead, it was an impact method that contained endless mysteries, countless details, and countless exquisite force exertion techniques. In the process of this impact, who knew how many force exertion techniques were used in the impact? It could be said that if a martial artist were to witness this process of charging, that martial artist would be able to comprehend boundless martial profundities from it. In the end, it would allow one's cultivation to rise ceaselessly and even attain a supreme, self-sufficient realm. This kind of impact method almost made use of the advantage of the environment to the extreme. The innumerable impacts, the innumerable distortions, and the unimaginable power generated by the eruption seemed to have been born specifically for the impact. Under its guidance, almost all of it gathered at the most real location, causing a terrifying explosion that shook the world. In the end, a thin crack appeared there, a crack that led to the next level. Taking advantage of this time, the spiritual light quickly rushed into it and disappeared without a trace. As the spiritual light rushed in, the crack lost the power to maintain it. In the blink of an eye, it completely closed up as if it had never been there. At this moment, after losing the spiritual light, or rather, the little girl's will control, the various movements caused by her remaining power were no longer able to resist the world. Under the malice of the world, it was completely wiped out in a short while. In the end, it disappeared without a trace, as if it had never been there. Soon after, the world became clear again. The various distortions of the world and the folds of time and space were completely wiped out. It could be said that apart from the absence of the fused sage-to-be, the entire world seemed to be no different from before the little girl had entered. As for the malice of the world, it gradually dissipated after fluctuating in the void for a while. Cheating? Who does she think I am? At this time, Luo Fan's face showed an inexplicable expression as he muttered. He was speechless about the judgment of the seventh tribulation powerhouse. Although he was not against cheating, he had an almost absolute advantage at this moment. How could he cheat? Wasn't this directly lowering his own status? In fact, the reason why those quasi-sages knew that there would be extraterrestrial demons descending on that world was very simple. It was completely determined by the cultivation system of that world. The cultivation system of that world was sublimated from the cultivation system of the prison that the seventh tribulation powerhouse had constructed. On the other hand, the cultivation system in the prison was completely based on the prison's confinement principles. Under such circumstances, the cultivation system of this world naturally had an extremely close relationship with the principle of confinement. It could be said that the rejection and vigilance of confinement at the core of the cultivation system had already penetrated deep into the bones. As a result, the cultivation system of that world would inevitably have a strong sense of crisis when one went deeper into it. Different cultivators had different understandings of this sense of crisis. Some had doubts about the structure of the world itself. Some had doubts about the foundation of the cultivation system. Some were worried about foreign species, and so on and so forth. There were all kinds of worries. Obviously, although the level of quasi-sages was nothing to Luo Fan and the seventh tribulation powerhouse, it was actually extremely high in essence. At this level, it could be said that they had come into contact with some of the essence of the cultivation system. Therefore, such worries were naturally reflected on the quasi-sages in various forms. And the little girl's appearance was obviously because she had chosen the most logical and explainable possibility out of all the possibilities of danger that they were worried about, the possibility of an invasion of an alien species. Because of this, they acted as if they had long expected it. After discovering the abnormality of the little girl, they immediately confirmed that she was an invasion by extraterrestrial demons. Thus, it caused the seventh tribulation powerhouse to misunderstand. Genius 1 Second Remember website. Mobile version. Chapter 3021. While Luo Fan was fighting with the middle-aged woman, Luo Fan's other incarnation had already forgotten about everything that was happening here. At this moment, he had once again devoted all his attention to discussing Tao with Taoist Hongqua. Luo Fan was naturally very clear about everything that was happening here. On the other hand, Taoist Hongqua, who was standing beside him, was completely different. He was completely unaware of everything that was happening here. The reason for this was very simple. Everything was closely related to Luo Fan, but it had nothing to do with Taoist Hongqua at all. The layer of nothingness that they were in was much deeper than the layer of nothingness that was the easiest to reach. Under normal circumstances, given the structure of the layer of nothingness, the shallower layer of nothingness should be able to see everything clearly from a bird's eye view. However, this obviously did not mean that one could see through all the hidden secrets of the shallower layer as long as one was in a deeper layer. It was just like how a person standing outside a planet could indeed see everything that was happening on the surface of most of the planet clearly in theory. However, what could an ordinary person see outside a planet? He might not even be able to see if there were any living beings or civilizations on the planet with his naked eye. There was a huge difference between the situation in theory and reality. Similar to the experience of ordinary people standing outside the planet, it was the same for the cultivators in the shallow layer that they could see from the deeper layer of the ocean of nothingness. In theory, if one stood at a deeper layer, they could see through almost all the secrets in the shallower layer. As long as they were willing to pay attention, they could even be omniscient about the situation in the shallower layer. However, that was only in theory. In fact, due to the limitations of a cultivator's knowledge, Even if a cultivator was at a deeper layer, he could only see and distinguish things that were related to him. Theoretically, they could see through things that were unrelated to them, but in reality, there were not many who could see through them. Taoist Hongqua's situation was no exception. In theory, everything that was happening in the layer of the ocean of nothingness, which was the easiest to reach, should be happening right under his eyes. He should be able to see everything clearly. Even the details that Luo Fan himself couldn't see should be clearly seen by him. However, it was clear that this was not the case. To him, the battle between Luo Fan's avatar and the middle-aged woman was like a battle between two ants in an ant's nest on a planet. How could a person standing outside the planet see the process of the battle clearly? Even though the battle between the two ants had already turned the ant nest upside down. Therefore, even though everything was happening right before his eyes, Taoist Hongqua did not notice it at all. For him, guessing that something related to Luo Fan had happened in the shallow layer could only be guessed from the special behavior of Luo Fan's avatar. As for what exactly had happened, he had no idea at all. Under such circumstances, since Luo Fan did not want to talk about it, he could only pretend that nothing had happened. However, for Taoist Hongqua, what happened in the shallow layer obviously did not matter to him. For him, compared to what had happened in the shallow layer that had nothing to do with him, it was obviously more interesting to communicate with Luo Fan about their cultivation, their understanding of the sixth level of the Tao Master's path, their understanding of the state of chaos, and their understanding of various places of opportunity. Therefore, Luo Fan directly pretended that nothing had happened, which was exactly what he wanted. On this day, Taoist Hongqua said to Luo Fan, "After so many battles, our side has obtained a considerable number of places of opportunity, many of which can correspond to the cultivation of the sixth level. I wonder if you would like to go there?" The places of opportunity were created by many true sages for the cultivation of many cultivators, and they were distributed in the state of chaos. They were located between many true sages, or in other words, between many great worlds and perfect worlds. Many path of true divines had fought against each other over the ownership of these opportunities of fortune. Since there were wars, there were naturally winners and losers, and the ownership of these places of opportunity was naturally divided. As the number of wars increased, the path of the true sage would naturally occupy a considerable number of opportunity lands. The Tao Master's path was also a true sage's path that participated in wars and naturally occupied a considerable number of places of opportunity. However, the places of opportunity were different and had their own inclinations, and the factors of convenience also had their own emphasis. In this way, the places of opportunity that corresponded to the cultivation of the sixth level of the Tao Master's path naturally existed. What do you mean by that? Could it be that you have a way to enter those places of opportunity? Luo Fan asked. Of course. However, this is actually not a secret. The way to enter those places of opportunity is actually very widespread. Although not everyone knows about it, it is not far from it. Taoist Hongqua smiled slightly. Luo Fan only thought for a moment before he suddenly understood what he meant. After all, those places of opportunity corresponded to the cultivation of the sixth level of the Tao Master's path. The cultivators who were most suitable to enter those places of opportunity were naturally the six tribulation powerhouses. However, based on the fact that the cultivators who decided to enter the places of opportunity had some sense of the overall situation, they would certainly not keep the method of entering the places of opportunity a secret. Even if they did not directly allow all the six tribulation powerhouses to enter, they would certainly not create too many obstacles for them to enter. Therefore, it was natural that the way to enter the places of opportunity was widespread. I see, please teach me. Luo Fan immediately cupped his hands and said, although the time they had spent discussing the Tao wasn't considered long, it could barely be considered a short time. After such a period of discussion, although the friendship between them could not be said to be too deep, it could be said to be somewhat close. With this friendship, of course, he could directly make some requests that were not too excessive. Moreover, at this time, when Taoist Hongqua brought up this topic, it was obvious that he wanted to help him, so he naturally did not need to be polite. Taoist Hong Kuo smiled slightly and said, "As long as you are willing to listen, of course there is no problem." As he spoke, he opened his mouth and said a magic formula. Compared to the way to enter the places of opportunity that Luo Fan had obtained before, this magic formula was more subtle and more versatile. It felt like an ordinary magic formula. If one was less knowledgeable, he might not even be able to see the function of this magic formula. Luo Fan immediately remembered this magic formula, and in his heart, he had a rough idea of how this magic formula was born. After carefully pondering for a while, his expression could not help but become slightly complicated. After a while, he inexplicably sighed and said, "Taoist friend, how can I repay you by doing this?" However, after careful consideration, he found that this magic formula was actually not only a way to enter the places of opportunity that corresponded to the 6th level of the Tao Master's path, but also a way to enter all the places of opportunity that had already been occupied by the Tao Master's path. In other words, through this magic formula, not only could he enter the places of opportunity that corresponded to the 6th level of the Tao Master's path, but it could also allow him to enter all the places of opportunity that had already been occupied by the Tao Master's path. Such places of opportunity obviously included some public places of opportunity, as well as those that were hidden. Compared to the original guess of Luo Fan, this was simply like the difference between an egg and a huge chicken farm. It went without saying how big the gap was. If it was originally just to enter the places of opportunity that corresponded to the 6th level of the Tao Master's path, Luo Fan, naturally, would not care so much. After all, such places of opportunity could almost be considered as semi-public. However, now that Taoist Hong Kuo had directly given him this basic common magic formula, he obviously could not remain indifferent and accept it. "It's just a magic formula. Why do you care about it?" Taoist Hong Kuo said with a smile. At this time, how could Luo Fan not know that Taoist Hong Kuo in front of him was probably quite extraordinary among the Tao Master's disciples? If it was not for his extraordinary identity, it would have been difficult for him to obtain this kind of common magic formula. Once again, Luo Fan could only smile bitterly and say, "You don't have to say these words. I can still understand the value of this magic formula." As he spoke, he stopped Taoist Hong Kuo from continuing to belittle him, but he also did not continue to entangle himself with how to repay Taoist Hong Kuo. After all, this was not a transaction. At this time, if he directly calculated everything clearly and then gave Taoist Hong Kuo a corresponding reward according to the value, wouldn't he directly turn Taoist Hong Kuo's kindness into a business? At this time, what Luo Fan needed to do was to remember this kindness in his heart and then return it when the opportunity arose in the future. As for whether the return was more or less than Taoist Hong Kuo's effort, or whether it was more or less than his own, it did not matter too much. Obviously, Taoist Hong Kuo was quite happy that Luo Fan did not continue to entangle himself with the value of this magic formula. Since it had been explained, Taoist Hong Kuo also pointed out some of the subtle changes in this magic formula. In other words, how to adjust the magic formula to enter different kinds of places of opportunity. Naturally, Luo Fan listened attentively. Although he would be able to figure these out if he put in the effort to study, it was naturally a good thing that someone explained it to him, which naturally saved him a lot of trouble. After a rough explanation, Taoist Hong Kuo said to Luo Fan with a smile, "I guess Taoist Hong Kuo can't wait any longer, so I won't keep Taoist Hong Kuo." Obviously, although Luo Fan behaved very naturally, Taoist Hong Kuo knew very well that anyone who obtained such a magic formula would definitely be eager to try this magic formula. It was just like when he first obtained this Dharma art. There was nothing for Luo Fan to be embarrassed about. To him, this magic formula was like a whole new world. It was a completely different way to open the door to the state of chaos. Naturally, he had a strong desire to explore this. At that moment, he smiled at Taoist Hong Kuo and said, "If that's the case, then I'll visit again next time. I only hope that Taoist Hong Kuo can find the next level as soon as possible. If Taoist Hong Kuo finds the next level, perhaps there will be a surprise." Taoist Hong Qua seemed to be deep in thought, as if he had thought of something. However, Luo Fan did not continue speaking. After cupping his hands, his figure flashed and disappeared without a trace. It was as if he had never been there. When he reappeared, he was not in the level where the mind incarnation was. Instead, he appeared in the heavens that belonged to him. He appeared directly in front of his real body. At that moment, Luo Fan's real body raised his hand and pointed at the mind incarnation. In an instant, the mind incarnation exploded, and the information contained within began to flow into the finger of his real body like rivers flowing into the sea. In an instant, a memory spiritual light appeared on his finger, which became brighter and brighter. After this spiritual light appeared, the light on it began to tremble and change continuously. Within it, there were many tiny black dots that continuously escaped and gradually disappeared in the void. As these black dots dissipated, the spiritual light became purer and more condensed. In the end, the speck of spiritual light became as clear as water. It trembled and squirmed on his finger as if it was a real living thing. This was that magic formula, or rather, it was the essence of that magic formula. Although the magic formula's method of transmission and appearance seemed to be just an ordinary magic formula, as if it was just a magic formula of some kind of cultivation magic formula. However, in reality, since this magic formula could be used as a path to many other places of opportunity that existed in a state of chaos, its essence and essence naturally could not be so simple. In reality, the essence of this magic formula was a kind of simulation and use of the combing power of the many true sage paths and the various places of opportunity. The countless places of opportunity were opened by many true sages for the many true sage paths. Such places of opportunity naturally could not be placed in a state of chaos randomly. The way they were born and where they were stored must definitely follow some kind of rule. Some kind of rule that was closely related to the many true sage paths. Only in this way could it be occupied by any true sage path. This kind of rule manifested in the many true sage paths. It was the combing power of the many true sage paths towards the places of opportunity. Chapter 3022. The technique that Taoist Hongqua had given him was a way to control that power. Through this magic art, cultivators could mobilize the combing power to a certain extent and enter some places of opportunity with the help of that power. Of course, the places of opportunity that one could enter were not all places of opportunity that were affected by this law. They were only places of opportunity that had been completely transformed into places of opportunity on the Tao Master's path. After all, this magic art's manipulation or mobilization of the combing power was limited. The limited mobilization represented a very wide range. Even a little bit of it could be mobilized was also limited. Almost all of it could be mobilized was also limited. Obviously, the kind of limited that this magic art referred to was that little bit of it. Such a limited mobilization could, at most, only affect the places of opportunity that were already part of the Tao Master's path. Therefore, it was obvious that they could only enter the places of opportunity that had already been seized by the Tao Master's path during the war. From a certain point of view, this magic art obviously had a lot of room for improvement. Moreover, its potential could be said to be infinite. However, it was obvious that although Luo Fan clearly knew that there was room for improvement, he could not perfect it at this time at all. Even though his understanding of the essence of cultivation had reached an incredible level and he could almost optimize any magic art that fell into his hands, it was still the same. After all, this magic art was only the most superficial appearance. The real key that determined the limits of this magic art was not the magic art itself, but the combing power. And now, although Luo Fan could see that there were many places in this technique that could be made more concise, the starting point that could be improved and the direction that could be expanded, he was too unfamiliar with the combing power. It was so unfamiliar that he couldn't be sure what the final reflection of any of his adjustments to the combing power would be like, and whether it would really be like what he had expected under such circumstances, it was naturally impossible for him to make adjustments to this technique. At this time, Luo Fan naturally would not think about all these things that he had understood from the beginning. At this moment, his body carefully took over the essence of the magic art, which was the inexplicable connection with the combing power. At this moment, the flickering spirit light in his hand was the manifestation of that connection. Just like how the distribution of the land of opportunity would manifest as a real combing force on the path of true sages, the connection between this and the combing force would also manifest as some kind of entity. At the very least, in front of a powerhouse at Luo Fan's level, it would take on a physical form. In other words, the appearance of the spiritual light in front of him, with a slight thought that speck of spiritual light was absorbed into his body. Immediately afterward, the moment this spiritual light entered his heart, Luo Fan suddenly felt that his perception seemed to be pulled by some subtle force. With this pull, his perception instantly rose and suddenly surpassed the path of the Tao Master. He touched a supreme power that was so grand that even the path of the Tao Master seemed to be insignificant compared to it. This power gave him a feeling that it was even grander, more vast, more powerful, more solid, more mysterious, and more irresistible than the power related to the true sage that he had encountered in the seventh tribulation. As for the power related to the true sage that he had encountered in the seventh tribulation, at least Luo Fan could still be sure that it was actually related to the true sage, and the mystery of it came from the true sage. However, at this time, in the face of this power that suddenly appeared in his perception, he was completely unable to determine where the mystery of this power came from. It was as if the mystery of this power was a matter of course, a kind of truth, an unquestionable reality, like an axiom that did not need to be explained, nor could it be explained. One could roughly know the source of its power, while the other could not even see the source. There was no need to say which one was stronger. Obviously, the great power in front of him was stronger and more incredible. Is this the kind of power? At this moment, even Luo Fan could not help but be shocked. This kind of power that was above the Tao Master's path was far beyond his imagination. Just comprehending this power will be of great help to one's cultivation. No wonder those Tao Masters don't care about the territory on the 6th level. Feeling the power, Luo Fan could not help but have such a thought flash through his mind. The disciples of Tao Masters on the 6th floor of the Tao Masters Road were in harmony with the individual cultivators, unlike the previous floors where they could not live under the same sky. In addition to the existence of the war mechanism, the disciples of Tao Masters did not care about the benefits of the 6th floor, which was also a very important reason. It might even be the most important reason. After all, in the first few levels of the Tao Master's path, the disciples of the Tao Masters were restricted to the Tao Master's path. If they wanted to cultivate better and obtain more, they needed to occupy a larger territory. Only with a larger territory would they be able to obtain more cultivation resources and grow better. As for the individual cultivators, they could only find a way out from the Tao Master's path. If their territory was occupied by the Tao Master's disciples, the territory they could choose would naturally be reduced. Once the territory was reduced, the cultivation resources they could obtain would naturally be reduced. With the reduction of cultivation resources, their cultivation speed would also be reduced. In this way, it could be said that the conflict between them could not be resolved. However, the situation in the 6th level of the Tao Master's path was completely different. Here, the cultivators were not limited to the 6th level. In the 6th level of the Tao Master's path, the cultivators could come into contact with a huge number of opportunities that existed outside the Tao Master's path. Almost every single one of the lands of opportunity was on par with the 6th level of the Tao Master's path. It could be said that compared to the previous levels, the world that the cultivators in the 6th level could come into contact with was tens of thousands of times, or even hundreds of millions of times. In this way, if they wanted to obtain more cultivation resources, they obviously did not need to only search the 6th level of the Tao Master's path. There were simply too many ways for them to choose from. In fact, just the unimaginably terrifying power in front of them was even more powerful than the cultivation resources of the 6th level of the Tao Master's Path. In this way, why would they need to fight to the death in the 6th level? There were no conflicts of interest here, so the atmosphere was naturally harmonious. Of course, strictly speaking, the conflicts between the Tao Master's disciples and the individual cultivators still existed. Perhaps the land of opportunity itself was limitless, but it was limited to the cultivators themselves. Under such circumstances, if they wanted to obtain more resources, they would naturally have to compete for those fortuitous lands. In such a process, there would naturally be all kinds of conflicts. However, because there were far more resources than the previous few levels, the competition and conflict between them was naturally not as intense. Naturally, it was not as obvious as it was in the previous 7 levels. At this moment, various thoughts flashed through Luo Fan's mind. He had a deeper understanding of the relationship between the individual cultivators and the Tao Master's disciples in the 6th level of the Tao Master's Path. However, very soon, he shook his head and put all these thoughts aside. His way of thinking was actually still influenced by the concepts of the previous levels. He still had not completely adapted to the situation of the 6th level of the Tao Master's Path. The main conflict between the Tao Master's disciples and the individual cultivators was not the main conflict between the cultivators in the 6th level. In fact, there was not much meaning in exploring the relationship between the two. For the 6th level of the Tao Master's Path and even higher levels, the real key and the real conflict was actually the conflict between the Tao Master's Path, or rather, the true Saint's Path. This conflict was the main conflict in the 6th level, and it was the focus that he needed to focus on. With this thought in mind, the conflict between the Tao Master's disciples and the individual cultivators finally had no place in his heart at this time. At this time, he also understood why the situation in the previous levels of the Tao Master's Path was so stable. Normally speaking, the higher level of the Tao Master's Path should be extremely displeased with the Tao Master's disciples who had such a great advantage and forced the individual cultivators into such a terrible situation. They would definitely use various means to change the situation of the individual cultivators. However, the final result was not like this at all. Apart from a very small number of individual cultivators who would put in some effort to help the individual cultivators resist and express some goodwill to Luo Fan who helped the individual cultivators to change the situation, most of the higher-level individual cultivators did not care about the situation of the individual cultivators in the previous levels at all. For them, it seemed that all of this did not matter. Originally, Luo Fan could not understand and even suspected that the individual cultivators in the later levels of the Tao Master's Path had been completely exterminated. However, now that he truly understood the relationship between the individual cultivators and the Tao Master's disciples, he understood that it was not that the individual cultivators in the higher levels had been exterminated by the Tao Master's disciples. Instead, there was almost no difference between the individual cultivators and the Tao Master's disciples here. Here, there was only one category of cultivators on the Tao Master's Path. Under such circumstances, it went without saying what the individual cultivators here felt when they saw the conflict between the Tao Master's disciples and the individual cultivators in the lower levels. At most, it was like watching two kindergartners fighting over the ownership of a playground. Of course, just like adults who were particularly concerned about the size of their children's playground, there would naturally be a portion of the individual cultivators in the higher levels who were particularly concerned about the situation of the individual cultivators in the lower levels. Therefore, there would occasionally be some support thrown into the lower levels of the Tao Master's Path. And just now, there were individual cultivators who expressed goodwill to Luo Fan after he helped the lower-level individual cultivators to change the situation. However, after all, such individual cultivators were only a minority among the minority. After all, most individual cultivators did not care about the playground competition in the kindergarten. Therefore, there would only be a small portion of support thrown into the lower levels. Similarly, it was the same for the disciples of Tao Masters. Why did Luo Fan make such great changes to the situation of the first few Dao Masters and destroy the cultivation environment of those Dao Masters? But in the end, there were still not many Dao Masters at a higher level who attacked him. The fundamental reason was that in their eyes, it was just a kindergarten. Luo Fan's attack was at most like a naughty child in the kindergarten who used rude and unreasonable means to change the playground of the different groups of children. It would be hard for him to even bully other children. Under such circumstances, there wouldn't be many adults who would intervene and teach that naughty child a lesson. Of course, there wouldn't be many, but that didn't mean there wouldn't be any. This was also the reason why Luo Fan was attacked by the Dao Master's disciples in the previous levels from time to time, but there was no really powerful Dao Master's disciples who attacked him with power that he could not resist. After all, there were only a few adults who could lose face. All these thoughts flashed through Luo Fan's mind, and a relaxed and helpless smile appeared on his face. Then, he shook his head and focused his attention on the inconceivably terrifying power, slowly experiencing the supreme mysteries contained within it. In it, Luo Fan could clearly feel that there was an endless world behind that power, and these worlds were hidden in the endless fog, so he could vaguely feel them, but he could not see them clearly, let alone touch them. Among them, different worlds had different degrees of blurriness. Some heavens and earth were just faintly discernible shadows, and even Luo Fan was not sure whether they existed or not. However, there were some worlds that were only a step away from becoming clear. It seemed that as long as one rubbed his eyes a little, he could clearly see the true appearance of the world. For Luo Fan, as long as he could really see it clearly, he was only a piece of paper away from stepping into it. Even if it was a chaotic world or a perfect world, he could easily find a way to step into it after seeing it, let alone other places. Chapter 3024. Is it because of the skill itself? Or is it because of that power? Luo Fan was puzzled. There were obviously two possibilities for his incarnation to be unable to bear the technique. The first was that the level of exquisiteness of this technique was beyond his imagination, causing Luo Fan to make a mistake in his judgment. He was unable to construct an incarnation that could bear the technique to accommodate it. The second possibility was naturally due to the source of this technique, which was a power that was even more mysterious and profound than that of a true divine. It greatly increased the pressure of the technique, causing the avatar that Luo Fan had constructed to contain the technique to be unable to withstand it. Obviously, Luo Fan ruled out the first possibility at the first moment. After all, he was the one who created the skill. How could he not know how strong the pressure of the skill itself was, and what kind of carrier was needed to contain the skill? It could even be said that with his experience in cultivation realm, he did not need to think much at all. He could instinctively adjust and let the clone that he split off easily bear the skill. Therefore, it was obvious that it was impossible for the subtlety of that technique to exceed Luo Fan's expectations to cause the current result. Since it was not the first possibility, it was naturally very likely that it was the second possibility. If one thought about it carefully, it seemed that it was very likely that this situation had happened. After all, the reason why this technique was able to allow one to step into various places of fortuitous encounters was because this saber technique had an inseparable connection with that power. This connection allowed the technique to easily use a portion of that power's power. Then it could pass through the state of chaos and step into another area of the state of chaos, the land of opportunity, or in other words, the world. Under such circumstances, the skill would obviously be affected by that power. Since it wanted to use the power of that power, it naturally needed to receive the feedback of that power. And the result of this influence was that the requirement for the object that the skill could bear was many times stronger than ordinary skills. Obviously, the avatar that Luo Fan had constructed before did not reach the level of bearing that kind of feedback. That was why when the incarnation separated from the real body, the moment it bore the spell, it was directly crushed. Facing such a situation, it was obvious what he should do. Since an incarnation alone could not withstand the magic art, he naturally needed to strengthen the incarnation, at least in terms of its endurance. for an existence at the level of Luo Fan. As long as he realized the existence of the root of the problem, it usually meant that the problem had been solved. At this moment, since he already knew why the incarnation collapsed and why it couldn't withstand the pressure of the technique, he naturally knew how to improve his incarnation. With a thought, another avatar separated from his body. Compared to before, the speed at which this incarnation was created was more than 100 times slower. Previously, with just a slight shake of his body, another body directly appeared beside him. The entire process was as if the incarnation had appeared out of thin air. But now, his method of creating another clone had become extremely slow. It was as if he was giving birth to a child. At first, there was a double image of his body. Then, the double image became more and more obvious. Then, the double image gradually began to move away from his real body. After spending more than 10 minutes, the incarnation finally separated from his real body. At this moment, the aura that this incarnation exuded was completely different from the previous incarnation. In terms of strength alone, it was already far above the original incarnation. Secondly, there was another difference, which was also the most important difference. Compared to the original incarnation, the existence of this incarnation was at least 10,000 times stronger. It felt like this incarnation's existence was even stronger than his real body's. The most obvious effect of this existence was that even if there were hundreds of millions of identical bodies arranged in a pile, everyone would immediately focus their attention on the incarnation in front of them. It's done. Sensing that the incarnation had stabilized, an inexplicable smile appeared on Luo Fan's face. At this moment, the incarnation did not collapse, which meant that his previous guess had come true. Just like the previous incarnation, this incarnation carried the secret art created by Luo Fan in its heart. Moreover, at this moment, the incarnation could faintly feel an indescribable pressure coming from the technique. It pressed down on every part of the incarnation, making it feel as if it was bearing the weight of hundreds of millions of worlds. It was extremely uncomfortable. But no matter what, the incarnation did not collapse because of the pressure. In the end, it still maintained the appearance of a complete incarnation. It's a pity that this can't be passed on to others. After carefully sensing the interaction between the technique and the incarnation, Luo Fan could not help but sigh inwardly. Even his incarnation had to endure that technique with great difficulty, let alone other cultivators. It could be said that, under normal circumstances, if other living beings were to accept this technique, they would have to endure pressure that was more than 100 times stronger than what his incarnation had to endure. Obviously, ordinary cultivators, even experts of the 7 tribulations, would not be able to endure such terrifying pressure without suffering any injuries, and Taoist Hong Qua, whom Luo Fan had wanted to pass on this technique to, was obviously not the kind of existence that could endure such terrifying pressure. Therefore, it was obvious that Luo Fan's previous idea could not be implemented. Since it could not be implemented, Luo Fan did not think too much about it. At this time, he actually understood that Taoist Hong Qua might not need him to pass on this technique to him, although this technique was created by him. However, judging from the situation of the technique that Taoist Hong Qua passed on to him, a technique similar to the one that Luo Fan had created at this time must have appeared before. Since it had appeared before, it seemed that it was not surprising that a disciple of a Tao master like Taoist Hong Qua could obtain it. Even Luo Fan had some doubts that the technique that Taoist Hong Qua had passed on to him was actually just a small part of the general technique that had been extracted and expanded. If this was the case, then it was obvious that Luo Fan passing on this technique to Taoist Hong Qua was just superfluous. As he thought of this, he gave up on his original idea. At this moment, he began to run this technique, and a lot of stars appeared in his perception. These were the stars that were outside of the Tao Master's path. They were obviously places of opportunity that had been seized by the Tao Master's path and belonged to the Tao Master's path. Previously, if he wanted to perceive the places of opportunity, he needed to connect with the coordinating force. Then, With the help of the coordinating force and the connections between the various places of opportunity, he could only perceive them by changing his perspective. Now, with this technique that was summarized and integrated from various perspectives, the situation was obviously completely different. This spell itself had already replaced the coordinating force and the many different perspectives. Relying on this replacement, after running this technique, he could naturally bypass the middle process and directly see the final result, which was the many places of opportunity. This was just like in normal times, when running the technique given by Taoist Hong Kua. Generally, one could only see the places of opportunity that were suitable for the 6th level of the Tao Master's path out of thin air. This was because Luo Fan's technique was extremely brilliant, and also because the technique itself was not perfect, there was still a lot of room for adjustment, so he could directly see the coordinating force. Looking at the stars, Luo Fan slightly adjusted the technique, and the distance of the countless stars in front of him began to change. In his eyes, a star was extremely enlarged, but the other stars began to quickly move away. In the blink of an eye, that star had already grown to an incredible size in his eyes, and it was as huge as a bright moon. On the other hand, the other stars had already completely disappeared from his line of sight. At this moment, there was an inexplicable feeling in Luo Fan's heart. It seemed that as long as he wanted to, he could directly step into the bright moon in front of him. In other words, he could step into the place of opportunity. Let's go in and have a look. Slightly moved, Luo Fan directly let his incarnation follow this inexplicable feeling and step lightly toward the place of opportunity. At this moment, the incarnation felt that the space-time around him had undergone an earth-shattering change, as if in just a moment, all the original space-time had been left behind infinitely far away. At this moment, the bright moon began to rapidly enlarge, as if it had turned into a meteorite and was smashing fiercely toward the earth. Immediately afterward, an increasingly strong pressure began to be released from the incarnation's heart. This pressure increased so quickly that before Luo Fan could react, it had already increased to the extent that it exceeded the limits of the incarnation's endurance. At that moment, Luo Fan's incarnation suddenly trembled, and then suddenly exploded, turning into dust and disappearing without a trace. At the moment before the incarnation disappeared, Luo Fan only felt that the incarnation had entered an unimaginably wonderful world. The surroundings seemed to be overflowing with colors, and endless principles and mysteries were crazily poured into the incarnation as if they were attracted by a black hole. However, all these changes happened too quickly. It was so fast that Luo Fan did not even have time to react before it was already over. In the end, Luo Fan could not even be sure if what the incarnation saw at that moment was real or just an illusion. Was the world really like that? Or was it just an illusion caused by some kind of distortion when the incarnation was rapidly shuttling toward the world? However, there was one thing he was sure of. That was relying on the incarnation to carry the magic skill to step into those places of opportunities was obviously a fool's dream. It seems that unless I use my real body to step into it, the incarnation may not be able to carry the complete magic skill to have any hope of entering. Luo Fan's heart was slightly moved, and an inexplicable sigh appeared on his face. Regardless of which possibility it was a problem that was neither too big nor too small for him right now. He did not reject entering it with his real body, but it was obvious that at this time, his cultivation in the 6th level of the Road of Tao Master had not really been completed. Obviously, his real body would not be able to leave in a short period of time. Therefore, although he did not reject the idea of entering those places of opportunity with his real body, it was obvious that it was unrealistic for him at the moment. And it was also quite troublesome to let the incarnation enter those places of opportunities without carrying the complete magic skill. If the incarnation wanted to enter the places of opportunities, it naturally needed to sense the places of opportunities. If he wanted to sense the places of opportunities in the state of chaos, of course, he would need to use the magic skill to guide him. At least for Luo Fan's incarnation, which was not a true saint, it was obvious that he could only do this with the help of the magic skill. Therefore, if he wanted to enter the places of opportunities without carrying the complete magic skill on the incarnation, of course, he would have to adjust the magic skill and create some broken, targeted magic skill so that the incarnation would have a chance to enter the places of opportunities. And obviously, taking a small part of the secret art that Luo Fan had spent so much effort to create, expanding it, and then recreating it was obviously not a big or small trouble. Therefore, no matter what method he used, it would obviously make it difficult for Luo Fan. It seems that the other 6 tribulation experts are using the second method. His heart slightly moved, and he also knew the source of the magic skill that Hong Kua imparted to him. Obviously, the problem he encountered was also encountered by many other cultivators on the 6th floor of the road to Dao Master, and their solution was the second of the 2 solutions that Luo Fan had thought of before. In other words, he could create an incomplete cultivation method that only targeted a certain land of opportunity, so that the cultivator only needed to bear the incomplete cultivation method. No wonder the magic skill is so crude. At this time, Luo Fan also knew why the magic skill that Hong Kua imparted to him was so crude. This magic skill was obviously an extension of a part of the complete magic skill at random. It could be said that it was just a temporary magic skill. Naturally, as long as it could be used, it did not need to be detailed. With all these thoughts in his mind, Luo Fan quickly began to break down the magic skill that he had just created in his mind. Genius 1 Second Remember website. Mobile version. Chapter 3025. The land of opportunity that Luo Fan had chosen was naturally not the one that corresponded to the spell that Taoist Hong Kua had imparted to him. If it was that land of opportunity, he naturally did not need to recreate the spell at all. He could just rely on the spell that Taoist Hong Kua had imparted to him to easily step into it. However, the land of opportunity that he had chosen at this time was only randomly chosen by him. It could be considered as the land of opportunity that was most fated with him. To be able to be chosen by him among the countless lands of opportunity, it could only be described as fated. Very soon, the spell that corresponded to the land of opportunity was directly created by him. Compared to the complete incantation, the number of words in this incantation was only a few dozen. Every single word looked so ordinary individually, but when put together, it was so exquisite that it was unimaginable. It could be said that every word combined with any number of words before and after it could form a crucial part of the key to this magic art. Moreover, every word combined with any other words to form a sentence would be meaningful to this magic art. The complexity of such a spell was enough for an ordinary cultivator to comprehend it after hundreds or thousands of years. However, for a cultivator at Luo Fan's level, he only needed a glance to understand the profoundness within, and he did not need to waste time to comprehend it at all. In other words, for an existence at Luo Fan's level, such a refined and complicated spell was actually no different from ordinary words. To them, there is no difference between compressing the spell to this extent and completely displaying the spell. Therefore, compressing the spell to this extent and using a few dozen words to replace a spell that would have required thousands or even tens of thousands of words to describe clearly was not an action that would create trouble for the reader. On the contrary, this method was actually quite necessary. First of all, after compressing the spell to this extent, the pressure on the carrier would be much smaller. With fewer words, the space needed to record the words would naturally be reduced. Naturally, the pressure on the carrier would also be reduced. If he didn't compress the spell, thousands of words, or even tens of thousands of words would obviously put more pressure on the carrier than just a few dozen words. At this time, the reason why Luo Fan had broken up the complete technique and extracted the part that was targeted at a certain land of opportunity was because his incarnation could not bear the complete technique. Therefore, it was natural to reduce the length of the technique and reduce the pressure it exerted on the carrier, or in other words, on Luo Fan's incarnation. As for why he was able to compress it to the length of a few dozen words, it was naturally because Luo Fan was able to do it. In any case, even if it was a few thousand words, it was already a certain degree of compression. Since it was all about compression, Wouldn't it be better to do it to the limit that he could? Secondly, only after the magic art was compressed to this extent could it have a stronger resonance with the magic art as a whole. This incantation was derived from a small part of the overall incantation that could be used to connect many places of opportunity. In this way, this incantation naturally already had a subtle connection with the overall incantation. This subtle connection was faintly discernible. For practitioners who were not at a high level, they might not even be able to perceive it. However, for existences at the level of Luo Fan, this connection was quite obvious. Through this connection, Luo Fan's real body could be more closely connected with the incarnation that carried the magic art. There is already a close connection between the real body and the incarnation. Coupled with the connection between the two incantations, it was equivalent to the two kinds of connections superimposing, so the connection would naturally be even closer. As for the function of this connection, Luo Fan did not forget that this incarnation would eventually be sent to the land of opportunity that was in a state of chaos, or those places of opportunity. Those places of opportunity were a perfect world that existed in a state of chaos. Such a perfect world was separated from the road to the Tao Master by a state of chaos. Even if the connection between those places of opportunity and the road to the Tao Master was beyond imagination because of the means of those true saints, this could not change the fact that there was a state of chaos between those places of opportunity and the road to the Tao Master. In this way, if Luo Fan sent the incarnation into those places of opportunity, the connection between the real body and the incarnation would probably be greatly weakened. In this regard, Luo Fan was quite experienced. Therefore, in order to prevent the real body and the incarnation from being completely separated as much as possible, Luo Fan obviously needed to strengthen the connection between the incarnation and the real body as much as possible. And this obviously required him to refine as much as possible. At this time, he had created the incantation that was extracted from the overall incantation. The incantation could be refined, reduced, and reduced in length. This meant that the original state of the incantation was relatively large, and there were too many unnecessary parts of the incantation. If one looked at it from another perspective, it would be that there were too many impurities in it. For the vast majority of things, impurities obviously existed to reduce the quality of those things. Obviously, this incantation was also one of the vast majority of things. The existence of these impurities in the incantation obviously caused the incantation to become impure, and in turn, it was possible for it to form a connection with more existences. In this case, if the purpose was simply to cultivate the incantation itself, naturally, there would not be much impact. At most, it would bring some interference to the existence that cultivated the incantation. However, if the incantation was not only about its cultivation effect, for example, if the incantation wanted to use the connection between this incantation and other incantations, such an impact would obviously be unacceptable. Although it has not reached the limit, it is barely enough. Feeling the subtle connection between this incantation and the overall incantation, Luo Fan secretly sighed in his heart. In fact, this incantation could be further refined, and the length of the words could be further reduced. However, if he wanted to continue refining it, he was afraid that he would need to spend a lot of time to study and reconstruct this incantation. Obviously, it would not be worth it to waste so much time for the sake of refining the incantation. Therefore, he stopped after reaching this step, and he didn't continue to refine this magic art. Compared to the incantation that Taoist Hong Kua had taught him, this incantation could be said to be at least 1,000,000 times more exquisite. Even though the length of the incantation was only a few hundred times different. From this point of view, Taoist Hong Kua, or rather, the existence that created the incantation, obviously did not care much about the connection between incantations. After all, with the means of a sixth tribulation powerhouse, it was rather difficult to refine an incantation to the level of the incantation that Luo Fan had now. It would take too much time, and the gains did not make up for the losses. However, it was not difficult at all to refine it to a few hundred words and reach an acceptable level. Taoist Hong Kua did not even do that, so it was obvious that he did not care about such a connection. At least, he did not intend to use such a connection for anything. In fact, it was precisely because of this that Luo Fan did not suspect whether Taoist Hong Kua had passed this incantation to him, because he wanted to use such a large number of connections to achieve some ulterior motive. As he thought about it, another clone appeared on Luo Fan's body. The sense of existence of this incarnation was comparable to that of the previous incarnation. It was also an incarnation with a strong sense of existence that was beyond imagination. At this moment, the clone's heart was already carrying the incantation that Luo Fan had just created, which was only a few dozen words long. Indeed, as he had expected, the pressure that this incantation brought to his clone was extremely insignificant. In fact, if he did not pay attention to it beforehand, he would have neglected the pressure. In contrast to the reduction of the pressure, the connection between the incantation was unprecedentedly strong. There seemed to be an extremely tough thread that connected this incantation to the complete incantation where Luo Fan's real body was located. Following Luo Fan's will, the incarnation lifted its foot and took a step forward. Its figure had already stepped into the only bright moon in the incarnation's perception. Following this change, the clone in Luo Fan's heavens began to gradually dissipate, and it did not take long for it to disappear as if it had never appeared before. At this moment, there was no need to describe how Luo Fan's clone felt. At this moment, he felt as if there was an invisible hand grabbing the end of a ball of thread on his body and pulling it away at a rapid speed. Although the connection between his real body and the clone was slightly weakened, the speed of weakening was much slower than the previous clone. At this moment, the clone had directly crashed into the bright moon. In other words, he had crashed into the land of opportunity that he had randomly chosen. It was a world, an extremely vast world. Just like the scene transmitted by the previous clone before it disappeared, the world was filled with flowing lights and vibrant colors. At this moment, endless principles and mysteries seemed to have encountered a black hole as they crazily squeezed towards the clone. In the beginning, Luo Fan felt a sense of comfort. After all, the principles and mysteries were what he had been pursuing and wanted to obtain. Now that the countless principles and mysteries crazily squeezed towards him and frantically integrated into his body and mind, the feeling was naturally quite wonderful. However, he soon felt that something was wrong. The speed at which these principles and mysteries were integrated was too fast. An indescribable feeling of fullness began to accumulate in his heart, making him feel as if he had turned into a balloon that was being rapidly inflated. His entire body seemed to be constantly expanding, as if he would explode in the next moment and turn into endless fragments. Moreover, these principles and mysteries were even more strange. At first glance, they seemed to be of the same origin as the principles and mysteries that he had comprehended in the past. However, if he carefully sensed them, he would find that there were too many obviously wrong things mixed in. And these obviously wrong things existed in the countless principles and mysteries in an extremely ingenious way. If he didn't pay attention to them, he would directly absorb them and start to distort the principles and mysteries that he had comprehended in the past. If such distortions increased to a certain extent, it might even impact his views and ultimately affect and distort his worldview. It could be said that these principles and mysteries were poisonous principles and mysteries. If he didn't remove the poison from them and absorbed all of them, it would definitely be harmful and not beneficial. Facing such a situation, it was needless to say what Luo Fan should do at this moment. Naturally, he had to do his best to prevent these principles and mysteries from rapidly integrating into his body and mind. And obviously, it wasn't an easy task to achieve this. This world, or rather, this land of fortuitous encounters, was simply too bizarre. In an ordinary world, if one wanted to find some principles and mysteries, one could only obtain them by comprehending them bit by bit from everything in the world and abstracting them bit by bit. If one wanted to integrate the principles and mysteries into one's body, the difficulty was beyond imagination. However, in this place, the principles and mysteries filled the surroundings like seawater. If one wanted to absorb them, there was no need for the cultivator to use any methods at all. The endless principles and mysteries would integrate into the cultivator's body and mind on their own. In contrast, if one wanted to stop these principles and mysteries from integrating, it would instead be even more difficult to abstract the principles and mysteries in the world. It was almost like an ordinary person trying to isolate the terrifying pressure brought by the surrounding seawater after sinking to the bottom of the sea. The difficulty was far beyond the scope of one's ability. With a slight thought, Luo Fan's incarnation began to gradually emit light. After this brilliance appeared, layers of dimensions began to unfold around it. As these layers of dimensions unfolded, the endless principles and mysteries that were surging towards him from all directions began to be quickly divided by the layers of dimensions. After this division, the principles and mysteries were quickly decomposed into various attributes and were instantly separated from their original overwhelming state. Although they were still surging towards Luo Fan's incarnation continuously, in each dimension, Luo Fan's protection had to face only a few tens of thousands of principles and mysteries. It's still a bit too much. Thinking like this, Luo Fan's incarnation once again emitted an even stronger brilliance. Originally, there were only tens of thousands of layers, but with this brilliance, the number of layers began to crazily increase. Chapter 3026. As the number of dimensions continued to increase, the endless principles and mysteries that were continuously pouring in began to be rapidly divided. Although there were inevitably a large number of principles and mysteries in each dimension, they still continued to pour into Luo Fan's incarnation. However, the quantity was rapidly decreasing. Not long after, when a number of dimensions increased to hundreds of millions, the many truths and mysteries that surged towards Luo Fan's clone were finally reduced to a level that Luo Fan's clone could withstand. At this point, Luo Fan only had to think about it, and the endless truths and mysteries that were originally unstoppable were all blocked outside his body. They could no longer surge into his body. With this change, the conflict between the truths and mysteries, as well as the shock and distortion that the truths and mysteries had on one's own ideas, all stopped. As the impact of the truths and mysteries stopped, Luo Fan finally saw his surroundings clearly. There was an extremely mysterious void of flowing light around him. In such a void, there were endless streams of light everywhere. These streams of light shuttled back and forth in the void. At every moment, there were billions of rays of light passing through every inch of the void. Behind this void of flowing light was a vast and boundless world. This place did not seem much different from a normal world. There were all kinds of living beings, all kinds of civilizations, and even the cultivation world with a large number of cultivators. This part of the world was covered by the flowing light, as if it was in another dimension, another space-time. It was separated from Luo Fan by a layer. If he wanted to enter that world, he would obviously have to break through the obstruction of this void of flowing light. If he wanted to break through the obstruction of this void of flowing light, he would first have to maintain his sense of self from the impact of the endless truths and mysteries around him. A place of opportunity like this isn't something that ordinary cultivators can enjoy. At this moment, Luo Fan knew that the land of opportunity that he had entered was probably not set up for a sixth tribulation powerhouse. Even he found it difficult to resist the endless principles and mysteries contained in the flowing light. He had to rely on the means of constructing a dimension in order to isolate himself from it. The performance of other cultivators in the face of principles and mysteries would only be worse, not better. Therefore, if they didn't have such a method of constructing dimensions, it would be impossible for them to stop the endless principles and mysteries. And if one couldn't stop such principles and mysteries, there was no need to talk about breaking through the void of flowing light and directly coming into contact with that world. He was afraid that even his ego would be affected, and in the end, he would be distorted by the endless principles and mysteries. If a sixth tribulation powerhouse stepped into this land of opportunity, what awaited them was obviously the same result. There was no possibility of an exception. It could be said that the flowing light void was a test to see if a cultivator was qualified to enter this land of opportunity. At this moment, Luo Fan's incarnation had obviously met the qualifications to step into this land of opportunity. At that moment, the incarnation no longer hesitated. With a light step, he had already stepped out of the flowing light void and stepped into the incomparably mysterious world behind the flowing light void. The moment he stepped out of the flowing light void, an indescribable sense of relaxation arose spontaneously. In a trance, it was as if he had completely unloaded the heavy burden that was originally weighing down on his heart. That indescribable sense of relaxation almost made him roar into the sky. Just this experience alone is worth the ticket price. At this moment, such a thought appeared in Luo Fan's mind. The feeling of being unloaded was quite wonderful for him. Moreover, he vaguely seemed to have comprehended something. He felt that his cultivation realm seemed to have slightly loosened, as if he was one step closer to the next realm. Obviously, such a gain was not something that could be brought about by the feeling of being unloaded. Therefore, this feeling alone was already worth all the effort that Luo Fan had put in to step into this land of opportunity. Taking a deep breath, the innate vitality surged in, and wisps of subtle information were constantly released from the innate vitality. This made Luo Fan feel as if his mind was being infiltrated by the information, and the indescribable, wonderful feeling almost made him moan. Of course, it was just an almost, and he did not really moan. Looking into the distance, the mysterious world was reflected in his eyes. The vitality of the world was still at the stage of innate vitality. Moreover, it was obvious that it would continue to stay at this stage, and it might even stay at this stage forever. Within this innate vitality, there was a wondrous aura that came from the world. At every moment, it constantly displayed all sorts of indescribable information that came from the world. This information resonated with the endless principles and mysteries in the void of light. The principles and mysteries in the void of light turned into nutrients that were constantly absorbed by the information through some mysterious transformation. No matter how much the information was lost, it would not be completely cut off. The various errors and distortions in the principles and mysteries in the void of light were directly eliminated and smoothed out by this mysterious transformation. This way, the information no longer had any hidden dangers and could be absorbed by any cultivator, bringing benefits to any cultivator. Not a bad land of opportunity. Although he had only come into contact with the innate vitality of this world, Luo Fan was already convinced that this land of opportunity would be of great benefit to him. Even if he did not pay attention to any other land of opportunity, just this place alone would be enough to satisfy his cultivation needs for a very long time. This was because the world was filled with endless amounts of innate vitality, so this world was naturally extremely extraordinary. The living beings here were almost all innate life forms. Being born with them already surpassed the limits of life and death, as well as the limits of lifespan. The various civilizations that developed on the basis of these living beings naturally had their own characteristics. The cultivation civilizations here were also very different from the cultivation civilizations of other worlds. Generally, the cultivation civilizations in this world clearly first pursued longevity, surpassing the limits of one's lifespan. However, in this world, living beings could already live forever and surpass the limits of one's lifespan. The cultivation civilizations that developed under these circumstances clearly pursued completely different things. Just from what Luo Fan could see, the cultivation civilizations in this world did not have much success in sublimating life. Instead, what the cultivators in this world pursued were all sorts of wondrous abilities. Because of this pursuit, this world developed all sorts of wondrous abilities that countless other cultivation civilizations could not develop. Many abilities that could only be obtained when one's strength reached an extremely high level in other cultivation civilizations. could be obtained when one had just started cultivating in this world's cultivation civilization. For example, the ability to reverse karma could only be obtained by pure primordial yang, or even connate grand luo in other cultivation civilizations. However, in this world, one could easily achieve this by cultivating a wisp of extraordinary power. Of course, being able to do it did not mean that everyone could do it. Because of this possibility, the cultivators in this world viewed legacies as extremely important. In other cultivation civilizations, it was already incredibly difficult to obtain true legacies. In this world, the difficulty of obtaining truly profound legacies was hundreds, thousands, or even tens of thousands of times more difficult than in other worlds. Because of this, the difference in strength between cultivators with and without legacies was as great as the distance between heaven and earth. If a cultivator without legacies had abilities of 1, then those with legacies would have abilities of at least 100. If one truly obtained a heaven-defying legacy, such as the kind that could directly reverse karma by cultivating a wisp of extraordinary power, then one's abilities would at least be above 10,000. Of course, this world was just too unique. Even cultivators without legacies were much stronger than cultivators of the same level in other cultivation civilizations. After all, cultivators in other cultivation civilizations could not focus all their energy and strength on improving their abilities and abilities. The first thing they had to take into account was the sublimation of life and transcendence. In comparison, the cultivators in this world did not need to care about the sublimation of life at all. To them, they were born with a high enough level of life. Under such circumstances, they could naturally focus all their energy on improving their abilities and abilities. One was multitasking, while the other was wholeheartedly focused. Was there a need to say which was stronger among those at the same level? However, this situation was completely different among the higher-ups. Because cultivation did not care about the sublimation of life, it was much more difficult for the cultivation civilizations in this world to cultivate to a higher level and reach beyond the connate grand luo compared to other cultivation civilizations. Moreover, due to the special characteristics of the connate grand luo, the difference between cultivators had been completely leveled out after reaching the connate grand luo level. In other words, the connate grand luo cultivators in this world's cultivation civilizations might have strange abilities, but in terms of strength, they were not much stronger than the connate grand luo cultivators born in other cultivation civilizations. After all, connate grand luo cultivators were self-sufficient and did not rely on external forces. Moreover, since they were called connate grand luo, they naturally had the ability to turn postnatal into innate. The difference in the world vitality would not affect cultivators. Perhaps it was because of this that the cultivators in this world were much stronger than those in other cultivation civilizations, even though they were extremely heaven-defying in terms of the lower levels. However, the cultivation civilization level of this world was not very high. Up until now, this world might have existed for hundreds of trillions of years, but the strongest in the entire world was only a false saint. There was not even a single despair cultivator who surpassed a false saint. This level of strength was obviously completely different from the heaven-defying performance of the lower-level cultivators. However, this kind of development seemed to be so natural. What a wonderful cultivation civilization! Luo Fan roughly scanned the cultivation civilization of this world and could not help but exclaim in admiration. He naturally looked down on the higher-ups in this world's cultivation civilization. Although the methods of those experts were strange, they did not exceed the scope of his mastery. In other words, no matter how strange the methods were, to him, when he was at the level of those cultivators, he also had those methods. What he was admiring now was the cultivation methods of the lower-level cultivation civilization of this world. These lower-level cultivation methods had almost unleashed the potential of the connate grand luo qi to the extreme. Through various unimaginably exquisite methods, with the help of the connate grand luo qi, one ability and method after another that could only be obtained when one's strength was raised to an extremely high level. This kind of profoundness was something that he had never thought of before. Although he could instantly understand the profoundness of it at a glance, he had no idea that this could be done before he saw it. It could be said that these cultivation methods had already opened up a whole new world in front of him, making him feel that his understanding of cultivation had unknowingly advanced a step. If I had known these before, it might have been easier for me to achieve my goal in that prison. This thought appeared in his mind. To him, the greatest use of these lower-level cultivation methods was that he could use them on himself when his cultivation was restricted. For example, in the prison island built by the Seventh Tribulation Powerhouse, if he had seen this land of opportunity before, he would definitely not have needed to go through so much trouble to break free from that prison. Based on the strength of the prison's restriction on his incarnation, it was obviously not enough to stop him from using the cultivation methods of this world. At the very least, it was not enough to stop him from using this train of thought. In this way, at that time, he clearly had the opportunity to easily use various abilities and methods that should have been used by cultivators of the Connate Grand Luo level, or even higher levels. At that time, if he was able to use those abilities and methods to break free from that prison island, he would obviously be able to save a lot of effort. Of course, in the end, he might still need to use the method of dimensional division to completely break free. But before he completely broke free, he would definitely be able to be much more relaxed than he was now. Genius 1 Second Remember website. Mobile version. Chapter 3027. While Luo Fan's incarnation was carefully experiencing the mysterious cultivation civilization, in the 6th level of the Tao Master's Path, in the most lively level of the Void Ocean, in the 365-level island of the world structure, the 7 Tribulation expert who had a bet with Luo Fan was struggling to survive. The 7 Tribulation expert was currently in the 2nd level. Compared to the 1st level, the strength of the 2nd level was slightly weaker. The difference in the strength of the world made the 2nd level's rejection of all existences that did not belong to this world weaker. Based on this alone, it was obvious that the 7 Tribulation expert would have an easier time entering this world and even become stronger. However, it was obvious that the connection was everywhere. The 7 Tribulation expert's situation in the 2nd level was obviously not dependent on the world itself. More importantly, it should be dependent on the 7 Tribulation expert herself. When she first entered the 1st level, or, in other words, when she first stepped onto this island, the 7 Tribulation expert was at her peak. Her body, strength, power, willpower, and everything else were not damaged. But when she stepped into the 2nd level this time, her situation was obviously completely different. In order to safely step into the 2nd level, she abandoned everything else except her life essence. In other words, compared to when she stepped into the 1st level, her state was tens of thousands of times worse. When she was in the 1st level, her state was so perfect, but she was still strongly rejected by that world. In the end, she was even suppressed into an ordinary person. In the end, she relied on the cultivation system of that world to barely obtain some extraordinary abilities. In the 2nd level, although the suppression and rejection of foreign things was weaker than in the 1st level, the 7 Tribulation expert state was tens of thousands of times worse than when she was in the 1st level. With such a combination, one could imagine what her experience in the 2nd level was like. At this time, the 7 Tribulation expert could not even retain her memory and self-awareness. She was directly suppressed by the laws of the 2nd level and thrown into the reincarnation cycle of the 2nd level. She was reincarnated as an ordinary creature in this world, living in a muddle-headed state. In fact, from the moment she stepped into the 2nd level until now, she had already reincarnated dozens of times. Every time, she would encounter a sudden misfortune not long after she reincarnated, and in the end, she would die a mysterious death. The longest time she had reincarnated was only 3 years. The shortest time was only a few days after reincarnation, and she had already died a violent death. It felt as if she was facing the arrival of the Grim Reaper. The reason for this was obviously because she was incompatible with the world, and it was because the world was rejecting her. Because the world rejected her, there were many accidents that targeted her. If it was before, when she was in good condition, she could easily deal with these accidents, just like in the first layer world. However, if her condition wasn't good, then the accident caused by the rejection of these worlds would be a fatal accident for her. That was why she had reincarnated dozens of times in such a short period of time. Every reincarnation was a form of harm to this seventh tribulation expert. Among them, the greatest damage was to her memory. Every time he died, his memories would be shrouded in a layer of fog. Every time he died, his memory would be shrouded in a layer of fog. After dying like this for dozens of times, her memory had already become unrecognizable. As a seventh tribulation expert, her memory was almost eternal. No matter how much it was shrouded, it would still be there, unshakable, and would not become chaotic. However, the more fog was shrouded, the more difficult it would be to reactivate it and dig out those memories. Just like gold buried underground, it was naturally difficult for the nature of the gold to change. No matter how deep it was buried, the gold was still gold. However, the deeper it was buried, the more layers of soil it was covered with, and the more difficult it would be to find the gold again. One day, when the gold was buried to a certain depth, it would become almost impossible to find it again. At this time, the situation was the same for this seventh tribulation expert. Her original memories were like gold. Every time she died, it was equivalent to covering the gold with a layer of soil. In this way, the more time she died, the more difficult it would be to dig out the gold. In the end, when the number of deaths increased to a certain limit, it would become almost impossible to dig out these memories. Of course, at the level of a seven tribulation expert, if she wanted to make it impossible for these memories to be dug out, she would need to die an unimaginable number of times. It was extremely likely that she would need to die hundreds of millions or even trillions of times. From the looks of it, her failure is already destined. At this moment, outside the island, Luo Fan's clone sensed everything inside and could not help but sigh inwardly. Although she would need to die hundreds of millions or even trillions of times to completely bury the memories of the seventh tribulation expert, according to how she reincarnated every few years, it seemed like it was only a matter of time. At this moment, in the deeper world, the essence of the seventh tribulation expert was constantly changing. She was constantly shuttling back and forth between many worlds. As she shuttled back and forth, the essence was also constantly changing. The environment of every world was different, and different worlds had different effects on the things that entered them. Even the essence couldn't completely escape this influence. In this way, when she entered different worlds, there would naturally be different changes. These changes clearly reflected the many mysteries contained in the essence. For Luo Fan, through these changes, he could understand more of these changes. It was precisely because of this that he allowed the essence to constantly shuttle back and forth between many worlds. In the essence, the starry sky of the universe had already become orderly. Under this orderly state, the countless clones that had fused with the many stars had already merged into a small number of stars, living and moving around on those few stars. These few stars clearly corresponded to some key points of the essence. Compared to the countless scattered stars from before, it was much easier to comprehend the secrets hidden within them now. However, it was still extremely difficult. At least, it was so difficult that it was impossible for Luo Fan to gain much in a short period of time. It seems that her cultivation on the 6th level of the Tao Master's Road is not too perfect. Although there wasn't much to gain, Luo Fan finally saw through one thing. This essence contained almost all the secrets of the seventh tribulation expert. This included the secrets of cultivation, the secrets of memories, and the secrets of encounters. Naturally, her state of cultivation at each stage was also included in these essences. It was precisely because of this that through the analysis and thorough investigation of these essences, one could naturally know what her cultivation state at each stage was like. At this time, Luo Fan had clearly discovered that there were some loopholes in the starry sky of the universe that represented the cultivation state of the 6th level of the Tao Master's Road. Some loopholes that shouldn't have existed. These loopholes caused the order formed by the various changes in the starry sky of the universe to become imperfect. When it operated, there were some bumps. This kind of collision was not very obvious in the past, but under the influence of the changing world and the environment, it was quite obvious. Get out of here. Suddenly, at a certain moment, all the incarnations of Luo Fan in this universe heard this voice at the same time. This voice seemed to be a little immature, but also quite mature. It sounded like a woman, but also like a man, seemed to be old, but also seemed to be a child. It seemed to be a single voice, but also seemed to be a voice that was intertwined with hundreds of millions of voices. Who is it? Luo Fan's heart was already filled with shock, and all the incarnations looked solemn. He couldn't find the source of this voice at all. It felt as if it had appeared in his heart out of thin air, as if it was just an illusion. However, it was obvious that it was impossible for one incarnation to have an illusion, but it was impossible for hundreds of millions of incarnations to have an illusion at the same time. Since it wasn't an illusion, it was obvious that this voice was a real voice. At least, it felt real. Luo Fan's incarnations looked around and found that the other creatures didn't feel anything. At least they didn't seem to have heard this voice. This allowed him to understand that it was extremely likely that this voice wasn't a real voice, but a type of telepathy. This was the essence of the 7th Tribulation Powerhouse, and the response that appeared in this essence could only come from this essence itself. Haven't you been exploring me? The incomparably complicated voice spoke again at this moment. This voice was also transmitted to Luo Fan's heart through a method that he couldn't understand, and he could clearly sense it as if he had heard it. You are this essence, or rather, this universe. Luo Fan frowned and said, the one who spoke was his countless incarnations, or rather, the countless incarnations that spoke at the same time. Luo Fan's performance made the creatures around him dumbfounded. Each of them looked at Luo Fan's many incarnations with a strange expression. They looked like they were looking at a madman. After all, anyone would feel the same way if a companion or enemy who was talking or doing something with them suddenly stopped and spoke as if they were talking to something that others couldn't see. At least, that was how it felt at the start. That's right, it's me. So, leave and continue staying here. You won't be able to obtain anything you want. The voice said. It contained an indescribable resistance, as if what it said was the truth of the universe and the essence of the world. The moment these words came, Luo Fan's many incarnations suddenly felt an indescribable sense of rejection appear in their hearts. This rejection was so strong that it made him feel like the entire world hated him, and the entire world was ready to kill him at any moment. The close connection that originally existed between him and his surroundings started to be completely severed at this moment. The secret hidden behind the truth that he could see at a glance seemed to be covered by countless layers of fog at this moment, and he could no longer see it clearly. In fact, even his many clones felt like they were gradually turning illusory and being wiped away. This situation was extremely similar to the behavior of the 7th Tribulation Powerhouse on the island, or rather, in that world. They were both rejected by the world and denied by the world. Following this change, the people around the incarnations were all horrified. They all watched as Luo Fan's many incarnations became illusory, as if an invisible eraser was gradually wiping them away. Faced with this situation, Luo Fan frowned deeply. With a thought, his many incarnations began to quickly gather towards the center. Streaks of light streaked across the starry sky, making it seem as though there were countless shooting stars in the sky. Shortly after, in an extremely short period of time, Luo Fan's essence, or rather, his incarnation in the universe, became the only one left. This only incarnation existed in the void, but it wasn't on any star. Because the speed at which his incarnations gathered was too fast, when this one incarnation finally appeared, the streams of light left behind by the countless incarnations still lingered in the void. It took a long time before they gradually disappeared. Those were afterimages, the remnants of speed. As the countless incarnations gathered into one, this one incarnation completely suppressed the world's rejection and rejection. At this moment, it became so real that it was even more real than before. In the surroundings, the void was constantly distorting, as if there was some kind of invisible force that was constantly pressuring the surrounding void. However, it was blocked by some kind of unimaginable force, unable to truly crush the void and completely affect Luo Fan's avatar. Chapter 3028. You shouldn't exist. You should be clear about this, right? At this moment, Luo Fan didn't answer the willpower's question at all. Instead, he asked such a question. So what? Existence is reasonable. Regardless of whether I should exist or not, I exist now. And since I exist, you shouldn't exist either. The willpower spoke again in that mysterious and unpredictable way. As he spoke, Luo Fan's powerful incarnation, which had an unimaginable sense of existence, sensed that an incredible and terrifying power had suddenly gathered in the entire universe. It turned into an endless flame that was like an ocean. In the blink of an eye, it had completely filled up an unknown number of light years around him in all directions. At this moment, Luo Fan's embodiment could feel a subtle sense of danger surging in his heart. Obviously, the flames around him that hadn't come into contact with his body weren't ordinary flames, but extremely extraordinary and terrifying flames that possessed incredible destructive power. At least, even among extraordinary flames, there definitely wouldn't be too many flames that could bring him such pressure. And the sea of flames in front of him was already extraordinary for being able to burn in the void of the universe. The fact that it could bring him such pressure was even more extraordinary. At this moment, faced with such a situation, Luo Fan's eyes narrowed, and rays of brilliance flashed on his body. An aura that belonged to the world of laws began to spread rapidly from his body. One must know that although Luo Fan's world of laws was still extremely far from perfection, it was still a world of laws that could withstand the assimilation and erosion of the simulated chaotic state in the seventh tribulation. One could imagine how stable such a world of laws was. At this moment, the appearance of this world of laws instantly wiped out the terrifying pressure that the sea of flames brought to Luo Fan's embodiment. An absolute sense of security instantly replaced the sense of danger that had appeared because of the sea of flames. The way this world of laws appeared at this moment was directly materialized. If it was in a simulated chaotic state, this kind of materialization would be enough to absorb the simulated chaotic state and evolve a world of laws. However, at this moment, it was facing the essence of a seventh tribulation powerhouse. Although this essence had obviously undergone some inexplicable changes and was no longer like an ordinary essence, its source was still the essence of a seventh tribulation powerhouse. As the essence of a seventh tribulation powerhouse, there was obviously an astonishing difference between it and the simulated chaotic state that could evolve an endless world. The void within, the power within, the laws within, and everything else were clearly incomparable to the simulated state of chaos. Therefore, at this moment, although the result of the materialization of the world of laws was also to absorb endless power, space-time, and laws in an instant, it could only barely turn into a projection of the world of laws. Furthermore, the shadow looked so illusory that it would be completely ignored if one were to relax for even a moment. At this moment, the phantom constantly expanded in all directions and immediately collided with the extremely extraordinary sea of fire in the surroundings. As the sea of flames collided, it seemed to have suffered a huge provocation. It began to gather frantically and directly wrapped around the huge projection of the world of laws, looking for any gaps that could be penetrated. It wanted to break through the barrier of the projection of the world of laws and burn onto Luo Fan's embodiment. Unfortunately, even if it was just a projection, its essence was still the world of laws. The defensive ability it possessed was ultimately determined by the world of laws. Therefore, in the face of such flames, The projection of the world of laws was stable, as if it was withstanding a gentle breeze. It didn't waver at all. Not to mention, it didn't suffer any damage in the flames. This situation made the existence of the flames further highlight the projection of the world of laws, making the projection seem more realistic. It was like a colorless and transparent thing. If it was originally placed in the same colorless and transparent thing, such as the air, it would naturally be difficult to recognize it. Even those with amazing eyesight could only barely recognize that thing through various other methods. Once they looked away, they would naturally ignore it if they weren't careful. However, if the surrounding colorless and transparent environment was changed at this moment, such as dyeing the surrounding air with some kind of flame-like color, it was obvious that the colorless and transparent thing would be further highlighted. Anyone, as long as they weren't blind, would be able to see what the colorless and transparent thing looked like more clearly than before. At this moment, the endless flames in the surroundings played such an effect. Because of its existence, it outlined the outline of the projection of the world of laws. Determining this outline was equivalent to completely confirming the existence of the projection. With such a change, the defensive ability of the world of laws had unknowingly been further strengthened. At the level of Luo Fan and the others, cognition was already an incredible power. Putting everything else aside, wasn't the worldview, which was originally an abstract, metaphysical existence, just a form of cognition if it was really strictly differentiated? Although this kind of cognition was extremely special and complicated, it ultimately didn't change the nature of cognition. From this, it could be seen how important cognition was for people at the level of Luo Fan and the others, and how real the power it represented was. There was no need to consider more at this time. For now, the most intuitive situation was that the projection of the world of laws had been highlighted. From a certain perspective, it made other living beings' understanding of the world of laws more intuitive and clearer. On the other hand, this intuition and clarity made the effect of the world of laws even more obvious. This situation could be applied to any living being, and it was even effective on any willpower. This also included the abnormal willpower that shouldn't exist in the essence of this seventh tribulation powerhouse. Because the flames highlighted the projection of the world of laws, the existence of the world of laws became more obvious, more substantial, and more real in the cognition of the abnormal willpower. Therefore, at this time, the effects of the world of laws of the abnormal willpower became stronger. Originally, the illusory world of laws would tremble slightly due to the burning of the flames. However, as the projection of the world of laws was highlighted, the trembling completely disappeared in an instant. The projection of the world of laws of heaven and earth was like an eternally motionless supreme existence that directly collided with the endless flames around it. Or rather, it was the will produced by the abnormality of this universe. Cognition wasn't something that could be changed just because one wanted to. It was relatively easy to change some abstract and metaphysical cognition. At the very least, as long as one had enough control over one's own mind, will, and concept, one could barely do it. However, it was extremely difficult to change the knowledge that was directly presented in front of him. It was like the projection of the world of laws in front of one's eyes had been highlighted. Since one had already seen it, it was obviously almost impossible to ignore it and remove it from one's cognition again. At the very least, it was obviously almost impossible to directly erase something that was directly reflected in one's cognition with one's own power. Unless one could directly suppress one's mind, will, and cognition with greater power, one could only achieve this. Obviously, in this case, it was almost impossible for any cultivator to erase their cognition in this way. Cultivators pursued different things, but no cultivator's pursuit was achieved in a situation where their cognition was completely suppressed by another existence. Therefore, under normal circumstances, in the face of such an existence that was directly reflected in one's cognition, even if one knew that it was precisely because of this cognition that made it more powerful and difficult to deal with. The abnormal willpower couldn't erase this cognition from one's heart again. It could only deal with Luo Fan's incarnation on the basis of this cognition, and deal with the projection of the world of laws that was countless times stronger than when it first appeared. What's the use of struggling? Fighting with me is not at all in line with your original purpose. Would you rather waste time fighting with me than leave this place? The abnormal willpower didn't continue to attack at this moment, and instead spoke again. Now that Luo Fan had become extremely difficult to deal with because of the projection of the world of laws, it was extremely difficult to defeat him. In fact, it even felt like it had become impossible. However, this didn't mean that the abnormal willpower didn't have any advantages. Its greatest advantage was that Luo Fan didn't have time to get entangled with it at all. One had to know that the essence of Luo Fan entering the seventh tribulation powerhouse was not to fight with it. What he wanted was to comprehend the mysteries of the cultivation of the seventh tribulation powerhouse contained in the essence. He wanted to comprehend some of the cultivation process that he was missing. Under such circumstances, the existence of the abnormal willpower was obviously a huge obstacle for him. If the abnormal willpower didn't stop and continued to pester and attack him, it was unlikely that Luo Fan would suffer any damage. However, it would definitely take up a huge amount of his energy. As a result, he couldn't continue to dig into the secrets of this universe, and he couldn't continue to comprehend the mysteries of cultivation contained in the essence. In this case, it was obvious that it would be impossible for Luo Fan to achieve his goal by staying in this essence. Therefore, in the opinion of the abnormal willpower, Luo Fan should obviously choose to leave this place. Leaving the essence of the seventh tribulation powerhouse, leaving this universe, and allowing this place to be completely free and under its control. However, it was a pity that it clearly didn't understand Luo Fan, or rather, it didn't understand cultivators. In fact, the moment the abnormal willpower appeared to Luo Fan, the true importance of this essence was no longer the mysteries of the cultivation of the seventh tribulation powerhouse. Instead, it was the abnormal willpower itself. A normal essence, even the essence of a seventh tribulation powerhouse, shouldn't have such a willpower similar to the will of the world. As the essence of a living being, or more specifically, the essence of a cultivator, it should have completely belonged to a cultivator. Everything within it should have corresponded to everything that a cultivator had. Even though the countless living beings that were born from it seemed like they were living beings, they were actually just reflections of a certain factor of a cultivator. It could be said that although those living beings were just like normal living beings, they weren't living beings in essence. The consciousness that they displayed seemed to be free, but it wasn't true consciousness. It was just a reflection of a certain existence related to the owner of the essence. Even if there might be a universe, a world, or a world within the essence, with billions of living beings within it, this essence couldn't be changed. Therefore, how could an existence similar to the will of the world appear with such an essence? After all, no matter what, an essence was only an essence. It couldn't directly become a cultivator. And this abnormal willpower, according to the essence of all living beings within the essence, should obviously correspond to the will of the owner of the essence. In other words, according to the essence of all living beings within the essence, the only thing that could become the master of the essence and become an existence similar to the will of the world could be the will of the owner of the essence. Clearly, this went against the nature of the essence. It was impossible for the essence to become its master, and it was impossible for it to become that cultivator. Therefore, this kind of willpower similar to the will of the world could never appear. Once this kind of willpower appeared, it would be an abnormal willpower. And this abnormality was obviously more worth exploring than the mysteries of the cultivation of the cultivator contained within the essence. After all, Luo Fan also had an essence. His essence was even more complicated and mysterious than the essence of a seventh tribulation powerhouse. If the essence in front of him could give birth to an abnormal willpower, didn't that mean that his essence could also give birth to such an abnormal willpower? This possibility was obviously enough for Luo Fan to not let go of the opportunity to investigate the reason for the appearance of this abnormal willpower. In order to prevent his essence from giving birth to such an abnormal willpower, it was obviously necessary to find out the reason. Genius 1 Second Remember website. Mobile version. Chapter 3029. No, the original purpose is no longer important. At this moment, Luo Fan said indifferently. As it spoke, the illusory figure of the world of law instantly released an indescribable power that swept across the entire universe. Of course, this power naturally swept across the extraordinary flames within a certain range around the illusory figure of the world of law. In that instant, the sea of fire was directly suppressed by the might. At a glance, it was visible to the naked eye that the sea of fire had dimmed. Seeing such a change, how could the abnormal will of the universe not know that Luo Fan had no intention of giving up? At the same time, it further thought that Luo Fan's goal had changed from exploring the mysteries of the universe in front of him to exploring himself. At this moment, an indescribable anger emerged from the bottom of its heart. Along with this anger, the sea of flames that had become much dimmer after being suppressed by the power released by the projection of the world of laws suddenly swelled up again as if it had been doused with kerosene. In the blink of an eye, it broke through the suppression of the power and became even more vigorous than before. You want to plot against me? It seems that I have to make you stay here forever. Such words were directly transmitted into Luo Fan's heart at this moment in a special way. Oh, are you confident that you can make me stay here now? Luo Fan said indifferently at this moment. At this moment, the power released by the projection of the world of laws skyrocketed again and once again suppressed the expanding flames. Boom, boom, boom. The suppression power and the power that urged the sea of flames to flourish produced a strong conflict. In an instant, almost every part of the sea of flames produced such earth-shattering explosions. The earth-shattering explosions broke through the barrier of the vacuum and spread to every part of the universe. Condense. At this moment, the voice of the abnormal will seem to come from the universe itself. It directly suppressed the earth-shattering explosions and replaced them to spread to every part of the universe. Following this voice, the vast and boundless sea of flames that occupied an area of unknown number of light years instantly began to shrink rapidly. The size of the entire sea of flames began to rapidly shrink. Every time the sea of flames shrank, the remaining flames within the sea of flames became more vigorous and their burning ability became more powerful. The pressure on the projection of the world of laws in the center grew stronger and stronger. The power released by the world of laws, which was originally able to contend with the power unleashed by the sea of flames, was also gradually withstood during this process. Following this change, the impact created by the collision between the suppressive power and the urging power in various parts of the sea of fire became increasingly intense. The terrifying roar that had been suppressed by that one word once again erupted within the sea of fire and spread throughout the entire universe. In the face of such a situation, Luo Fan's expression did not change at all. He was still as calm and composed as before. There was not the slightest trace of panic on his face. At this time, the method he used was just a probing method. Although it seemed to be enough to withstand the entire sea of fire around him, it was ultimately just a probing method. Compared to suppressing the surrounding sea of fire and disintegrating the attack of the abnormal will, he wanted to use this probing method to lure the abnormal will to make a move. Then, through the traces of the abnormal will, he would find the source of the abnormal will. As for why he did this, of course, it was because only by finding the source of the abnormal will would it be possible to figure out the reason for the appearance of the abnormal will. At this moment, this thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind as he sensed the traces that were faintly discernible at this time. The power of the sea of fire that was unleashed by the abnormal will clearly contain some traces that belong to the source of the abnormal will. However, these traces were still too few and too obscure. Even Luo Fan could not find the source of the abnormal will through these traces at this time. Since it was still not enough, there was no need to say what he should do next. In this instant, the projection of the world of laws flickered slightly, and countless powerful creatures directly rushed out of the projection and threw themselves into the endless sea of fire around them. These living beings were none other than the cultivators born from the illusionary figure of the world of laws. As a world of laws, although it was not a perfect world, since it was called a world, it was naturally impossible for there to be no vitality, no cultivation civilization, and no cultivators to exist. Since there were cultivators, as the owner of this world of laws, Luo Fan could naturally guide them. Even if he could not directly control them, he could still use various means to make those cultivators act according to his requirements. As for making those cultivators take the initiative to leave the world of laws and throw themselves into the surrounding sea of fire, there were too many ways that he could think of, and he did not even have the qualifications to mention them. Of course, there was no need to mention the reason why he guided them to leave the world of laws and step into the endless sea of fire around them. However, it was necessary to talk about the cultivation of these cultivators and the strength of these cultivators. Compared to other cultivators, the world derived from Luo Fan's worldview was obviously very different. No matter how strong the cultivators in the world derived from other unique worldviews were, there would still be a certain limit. Generally speaking, this limit was usually the false sage realm. If there was a world that operated the world derived from the worldview better, or if its unique worldview was more friendly to cultivators, then the limit of the strength of the cultivators born from the world derived from the worldview would naturally increase to a certain extent. However, no matter how much it increased, their strength would never reach the level of a tribulation stage powerhouse. In other words, no matter how strong a cultivator was, their strength could only reach the level of a supreme emperor. Even if they could go very far in this level and were extremely close to a tribulation stage powerhouse, it was impossible for them to surpass this level. This was because the foundation needed to become a tribulation stage powerhouse was simply too deep. Ordinary worlds, even perfect worlds, might not necessarily be able to satisfy them, let alone imperfect worlds created by cultivators who had yet to become true sages. However, it was obvious that Luo Fan's world of laws was different from ordinary worlds. At this time, the phantoms that were guided away from this world by Luo Fan and crashed into the surrounding sea of flames were all 6 tribulation powerhouses. That's right, it was the level of ordinary cultivators on the path of Tao Lord that Luo Fan's main body was at, the level of 6 tribulation powerhouses. This level of strength far exceeded the limit of the strength of ordinary cultivators in the world derived from the worldview of ordinary 7th tribulation powerhouses. Moreover, it was surpassed by tens of millions of times. The reason for this was actually not complicated. It was because in the 7th tribulation that Luo Fan had encountered, the world of laws had already contained too many world creators, because there were too many world creators in that great tribulation. The world of laws had unknowingly been engraved with all kinds of imprints of those world creators. Through these imprints, the world of laws already had the ability to evolve the owner of the imprint. It evolved in the way of the worldview of laws. And obviously, in Luo Fan's 7th tribulation, the limit of the world creators that were derived from the simulated state of chaos was obviously a 6th tribulation powerhouse. With this slight conversion, it was naturally understood that the limit of the strength of the world creators engraved in Luo Fan's world of laws was naturally at the level of a 6th tribulation powerhouse. Therefore, at this time, the phantoms of his world of laws were able to give birth to a 6th tribulation powerhouse. Of course, even the world of laws was just a phantoms, so the 6 tribulation powerhouses that were derived from it were naturally just phantoms. Compared to real 6 tribulation powerhouses, there was still an essential difference. However, this difference wasn't too big for the abnormal willpower. The reason was very simple, because at this time, the phantoms of the world of laws were extremely real to the abnormal will. For the abnormal will, the existence of the phantoms of the world of laws became more and more obvious and impossible to ignore because of the condensation of the flames. And the more impossible it was to ignore the existence of the phantoms of the world of laws, the stronger the power produced by the phantoms of the world of laws. Similarly, the phantoms of the cultivators derived from the phantoms of the world of laws naturally became more real and powerful. Therefore, at this time, although the 6 tribulation powerhouses were just phantoms, their performance in the sea of flames was almost no different from a real 6 tribulation powerhouse. As they crashed into the sea of flames, their bodies flickered with light, and phantoms of the world were derived from their bodies. Like bubbles that were derived from the world of laws, they began to prop up one flame vacuum after another in the shrinking sea of flames. If it was just 1 or 2 of them, it would naturally not have much effect on the sea of flames. However, it was not just 1 or 2 6 tribulation powerhouses that left the phantoms of the world of laws at this time. The number of phantoms of 6 tribulation powerhouses was calculated in the hundreds of millions. They formed groups and continuously infiltrated the various parts of the sea of flames. The phantoms of the world that they propped up even produced all kinds of subtle connections in the process, vaguely forming a complete whole. They resonated with each other, supported each other, and complemented each other. Finally, they formed an extremely strong and incredible defensive ability against the endless flames around them, blocking the extraordinary flames and establishing a foundation in the sea of flames with great difficulty. Although they only established a foundation in the sea of flames and did not cause any damage to the sea of flames, just the foundation they established was already of great help to Luo Fan. Due to the existence of these phantoms, the flames that were originally condensing and trying their best to reach Luo Fan's world of laws were directly blocked outside the phantoms of the world of laws. Gradually, they could not even come into contact with the world of laws. At this point, Luo Fan still did not stop. Instead, he continued to guide more and more cultivators out of the phantoms of the world of laws and towards the surrounding sea of flames, continuously establishing a foundation in the surrounding sea of flames. However, compared to the first batch, the cultivators that rushed out this time were not just at the level of 6 tribulation powerhouses. This batch of cultivators consisted of tribulation initiation, 2nd tribulation, 3rd tribulation, 4th tribulation, and 5th tribulation powerhouses. Their numbers were thousands of times more than the number of 6 tribulation powerhouses. Moreover, the number of powerhouses at each level was thousands of times more than the number of 6 tribulation powerhouses. They were much weaker than the 6 tribulation powerhouses. If they directly appeared in the outer layer and faced the endless sea of flames, they naturally would not be able to directly block the sea of flames like the 6 tribulation powerhouses, establish a foundation in the sea of flames, and support their own phantoms of the world. However, they did not need to face the sea of flames at all now. What they needed at this time was to support their own world and establish a foundation in the flames that were mostly blocked by the 6 tribulation powerhouses in the outer layer. Under such circumstances, these powerhouses naturally did it with ease. Very soon, their foundations were established, causing countless phantoms of the world to appear around Luo Fan's world of laws. They formed an even tighter protective layer, firmly and thoroughly isolating the sea of flames that was constantly condensing. How is this possible? Even if your means are brilliant and you can cultivate powerhouses of this level, how can you possibly cultivate so many of them at once? At this time, the abnormal willpower only felt that his worldview had been overturned. Such a roar spread throughout the entire universe in an instant, with Luo Fan being the focus of this voice. At this time, the voice was like a bomb directly thrown into his heart and then detonated with a loud bang, producing an extremely shocking pressure on his mind. Faced with such doubts, Luo Fan did not have any intention of explaining to him at all. He just continued to guide more and more cultivators away from the phantoms of the world of laws and into the surrounding sea of flames, continuously building a tighter and tighter protective layer for himself. His reaction made the abnormal willpower even angrier, and at the same time, even more bewildered. What kind of logic was there in this? Even a 7 tribulation powerhouse would not be so completely unreasonable. Could it be that I have overlooked something extremely important? Chapter 30:30. Normally, the world derived from the worldview of cultivators below the true divine realm would not be able to achieve what Luo Fan did. It was the same even with the marks of the creators of the world. After all, the world was the world. Every time a cultivator was born, there would be a certain amount of pressure on the world. The more cultivators there were, the greater the pressure would be. Even if a cultivator's cultivation realm was raised to the Khanate Grand Luo and could bring great benefits to the world, there would still be such pressure. Perhaps, in theory, the more self-sufficient cultivators there were, the greater the benefits to the world. However, this was only in theory. The survival of cultivators still required various conditions. For example, the communication between cultivators, the fights between cultivators, and other interactions would obviously affect the world. Such an effect was not caused by the increase in the number of cultivators. Instead, it was caused by the changes in energy, matter, rules, laws, space-time, and so on during the process of their interactions. Such changes would not cause much harm to the world if the number was within a certain range. However, when the number exceeded a certain scale, the damage would be unavoidable. In other words, in theory, the more cultivators above the Khanate Grand Luo that could be self-sufficient, the more benefits it would bring to the world. However, this conclusion was based on the fact that all cultivators were extremely rational, had an overall view of the big picture, loved the world, and had great self-control. In other words, this conclusion could only be reached in theory. In reality, such a situation would definitely not occur. When a number of cultivators increased, there would naturally be all sorts of personalities. Of course, there are only a handful of cultivators who could truly only bring benefits to the world and not harm it. Most of the cultivators would deviate from this perfect standard to some extent. If such deviations were small, the world would naturally be able to easily digest them with its endurance, thus avoiding the drawbacks caused by the existence of such cultivators and preserving the benefits that their existence could bring to the world. However, if the number of cultivators exceeded a certain limit and the deviation eventually exceeded the endurance of the world would naturally be unable to digest them. The damage caused to the world by the deviation would continue to accumulate. In this way, when it reached a certain point, the world would definitely collapse and perish. Therefore, the number of cultivators that any world could support was clearly limited. Once the number of cultivators exceeded a certain limit, the world would be destroyed. And the standard of this boundary was naturally different for different worlds. The more powerful the world, the higher the standard. However, no matter how high the standard was, at this moment, the number of cultivators that were born from Luo Fan's world of laws was clearly far higher than that standard. It was precisely because of this that the abnormal was unable to understand. In fact, if one were to really study it, the reason why Luo Fan's world of laws was able to produce so many Tribulation Realm powerhouses was actually not that complicated. That was because Luo Fan's world of laws had already fused the countless possibilities that might exist. In other words, the world of laws at this moment seemed to be just a world, but in fact, it already contained the countless possibilities of the main body of the world. The countless possibilities that couldn't be materialized as a parallel existence were now, like the countless subsidiary worlds attached to the main body of the world of laws. They piled up around the main body of the world of laws. Although the world of laws was only one world, it behaved like a group of worlds formed by countless worlds piled up together. With such a characteristic, even if the world of laws could only give birth to one Tribulation Realm powerhouse in the past, it could now give birth to countless trillions of Tribulation Realm powerhouses. Moreover, with so many marks of the world's founders, how could the main body of the world of laws only create one Tribulation Realm powerhouse? It would be a little exaggerated to say too much, but it was definitely not a problem to say hundreds or thousands of them. If the main body of the world had hundreds or thousands of Tribulation Realm powerhouses, then the number of Tribulation Realm powerhouses that were born from other possibilities would naturally be on a similar scale. And the possibilities were endless. In other words, there might be hundreds or thousands of Tribulation Realm powerhouses among all the possibilities. If they were piled up like this, the number of Tribulation Realm powerhouses could be imagined. At this time, Luo Fan naturally had no intention of explaining the bewilderment of the abnormal will to it. At this moment, he was just carefully sensing the surrounding sea of fire, sensing the traces that belonged to the abnormal will, and seeking a way to trace the source of the abnormal will. Even if the abnormal will was bewildered at this moment, the sea of fire still did not stop shrinking. At this moment, it was still shrinking inwards unhurriedly, constantly increasing the pressure of the sea of fire on everything inside. Compared to Luo Fan, the means of those Tribulation Realm powerhouses were obviously much weaker. The projection of the world derived from their worldview was naturally much weaker than the projection of the world of laws. Luo Fan's world of laws could almost completely ignore the burning of the sea of fire, but the projections of the Tribulation Realm powerhouses couldn't do the same. At this moment, as the flames continued to shrink and grow stronger, the projections of the world constructed by the 6 Tribulation Realm powerhouses in the outermost layer gradually began to ignite. Blazing flames began to wrap around the projections, constantly seeping into the interior of the world. This change shocked the phantoms of the 6 tribulation experts. Fortunately, they were cautious enough, or it should be said that Luo Fan's guidance was brilliant enough. At this moment, the projections of the world between them weren't completely cut off from each other. The positioning of their many worlds was already in line with extremely subtle principles. If it wasn't for the fact that this place wasn't in a simulated state of chaos, given the close connection between the many worlds, it would have been enough to build a simulated chaotic layer long ago. At this moment, after being burned by the constantly rising flames, the phantoms of the world immediately absorbed all sorts of nutrients from the other worlds they were connected to. They faced the rising extraordinary flames, clashing intensely with the extraordinary flames and withstanding them with great difficulty. However, the flames were constantly rising as the sea of fire shrank. The power of such extraordinary flames was naturally growing at every moment. At the end of the day, the silhouettes of the heavens and earth couldn't compare to the sea of flames. Even with the support of the other heavens and earth, which could constantly absorb nutrients from the other heavens and earth to resist the flames, they could only barely hold on and prevent the silhouettes from being completely erased by the sea of flames. In the end, it still wasn't enough to repel the flames. Therefore, at this moment, the projections of the world were still entangled by the flames. They looked like balls of fire that couldn't break free. As if seeing hope in this scene, the abnormal didn't take any new actions. At this moment, it only continued to push the sea of fire to shrink, constantly transforming the extraordinary flames in the sea of fire to strengthen its ability to harm the projections of the world, but it didn't take any further actions. This situation clearly didn't satisfy Luo Fan. If the abnormal didn't take any new actions, there wouldn't be any new traces appearing. Without any new traces, it would naturally be extremely difficult for him to trace the source. I have to provoke it. At this moment, such a thought flashed across Luo Fan's mind. It wasn't difficult for Luo Fan to provoke the abnormal will. At this moment, what was resisting the sea of fire were only the projections of the cultivators created by the world of laws. At this moment, he still had too many tricks up his sleeves that he had yet to use. Furthermore, the silhouettes of the cultivators had clearly achieved their goal of resisting the extraordinary flames. Under such circumstances, he had the time to use new means to resist the abnormal will. At that moment, his heart moved slightly. In the blink of an eye, countless concept divine abilities that were mixed with layers of stacked dimensions directly penetrated the phantoms of the world of laws, penetrated the phantoms of the world of cultivators and fiercely smashed into the endless sea of flames around him. These concept god abilities were extremely extraordinary. Each god ability was derived from a certain concept, and it was the most suitable for that concept. It was a god ability that could unleash the power of that concept to the fullest. Just this divine ability itself was already inconceivable. If it really fell into a world, any god ability would be able to completely change that world. It could add a certain attribute that didn't exist to that world, or even erase a certain attribute that should have existed at this moment. Luo Fan didn't just use the countless concept god abilities. At this moment, the concept god ability that he used was just a prelude. Its true power was the layers of stacked dimensions that the concept god ability added to. These dimensions were completely fused with the concept god ability. Each layer of dimensions reflected the entirety of the concept god ability. In other words, in each layer of dimensions, there was a concept god ability that was most suitable for that dimension. Just this alone allowed the concept god ability to be equivalent to a god ability that had the same number of dimensions with the help of the layers of dimensions. Not to mention that these dimensions themselves had incredible splitting abilities. It was enough to split everything they encountered into the corresponding attributes of these dimensions and directly incorporate them into the layers of dimensions. It could be said that this step alone was enough to instantly split the enemy's power into the same number of dimensions. In other words, the enemy's power would be weakened to 1/10 of the number of dimensions. Under the buffs of the concept god powers, the number of dimensions was increased by several times, and the enemy's power was weakened to 1/10 of the number of dimensions. Under such circumstances, the advantage of these countless concept god powers was self-evident. It could be said that even if the enemy's power was many times stronger than the concept god abilities, as long as they couldn't defend against the dimension-splitting method, they wouldn't be able to do anything to the concept god abilities that Luo Fan released at this moment. At this moment, the power of the surrounding sea of fire might be many times that of the concept god abilities, but the amount of fire that each concept god ability touched was clearly only a small part of the entire sea of fire. In this way, it went without saying what kind of effect the concept god art that was enhanced with layers of multiple dimensions could achieve. Wherever the concept god abilities passed by, the sea of fire seemed to be instantly devoured. Large patches of fire were extinguished. The terrifying pressure that was originally increased due to the shrinking of the sea of fire was like a murderer that pushed people down a cliff. It kept pushing more and more flames towards the concept god abilities that were enhanced with dimensions. These concept god abilities were like black holes that frantically absorbed the endless flames around them, devouring and eliminating more and more flames. Faced with such a situation, how could the abnormal willpower still dare to do nothing like before? The power of the concept god abilities was beyond his imagination. If he allowed these concept god abilities to continue wreaking havoc, perhaps the entire sea of fire would be completely wiped out. Once that happened, wouldn't Luo Fan be free from any restrictions? By then, wouldn't he be able to destroy this part of the universe at will? If he lost this part of the universe, how could he still exist? Therefore, at this moment, after discovering that the surrounding sea of fire couldn't do anything to the concept god abilities, the abnormal willpower could only attack again. In this instant, an indescribable disintegration power appeared out of nowhere and directly acted on the concept god abilities. This disintegration power was extremely subtle. Although it was called power, it only appeared to be power. In fact, it didn't have a main body of power. In other words, there wasn't anything that could be touched to refer to this power. Instead, it was more like some kind of strange mechanism. Some kind of strange mechanism that was like a fundamental rule. Under this mechanism, the connection between the many dimensions and the concept god abilities was quickly separated. With this separation, although those dimensions still existed and were still functioning, devouring the endless flames around them, there are no longer any divine abilities within those dimensions. Genius 1 second remember website. Mobile version. Chapter 30-31. Although the effects of the dimensional division were still the same, it could still continuously divide the endless flames into countless attributes and incorporate them into the many dimensions. However, because there were no longer any divine abilities in the many dimensions, even if the flames were divided into countless attributes, it would only be equivalent to having many containers that could contain the flames in a special way. Although it could temporarily eliminate the damage caused by the flames to the world created by the projections of the cultivators, it was clearly only temporary. As time passed, the numerous dimensions would eventually be filled up by the countless flames. Once the dimensions were filled up, they would either explode due to the fire attribute, or they wouldn't be able to absorb any more fire attribute. In short, the effects they had now would naturally disappear. Of course, all of this was on the premise that Luo Fan did not attack again. At this moment, Luo Fan's eyes lit up, but his focus was not on the dimensions. Instead, he seemed to be following some invisible trajectory toward a certain direction and was rapidly moving. In the blink of an eye, the focus of his eyes had already landed outside the sea of fire, on a strange void in the universe. This place seemed to be a very ordinary void. Even if it was any other star, it seemed to be more unique than this place, and it had a closer connection with the essence of this seventh tribulation powerhouse. It was precisely because of this that Luo Fan had never connected the source of the abnormal will with this void. However, this time, through the traces left behind by the abnormal will in the sea of fire, he managed to trace the source and find this location. He had found the source of the abnormal will and the corresponding point of the starry sky of this universe. So it's here. Such a thought flashed through his mind. Naturally, the source was not that expanse of space. However, that void was clearly a place that one had to pass to reach the source of the abnormal will. At this moment, Luo Fan no longer had any intention of continuing to be entangled with the sea of fire. With a slight thought, the projection of the world began to tremble violently. In the blink of an eye, an indescribable brilliance erupted from the illusory figure of the will of the world, spreading towards the boundless sea of fire. These lights were like living creatures. After they appeared, they began to absorb the endless sea of fire. Compared to the previous perception God powers and dimensions, the speed and intensity of this light's absorption of flames were tens of thousands of times stronger. It could be said that if the previous concept, God, art, and dimension were like the flames of a candle, then the current brilliance was like a star. It was the sun. The gap between them could be imagined. Faced with the absorption of the concept, God, power, and dimension, the abnormal intent still had time to take action. However, faced with the absorption of the light, the abnormal intent couldn't even react, let alone take action. In the blink of an eye, almost the entire sea of fire was absorbed by the brilliance. At the original location of the sea of fire, only the brilliance that was expanding and contracting like a living creature was left. At this moment, he could finally see the essence of that brilliance. Inside the brilliance, there were faint layers of overlapping shadows. These shadows were like flames viewed from different angles, as if the sea of fire was contained within the brilliance through various special methods. At this moment, Luo Fan waved his hand, and the brilliance disappeared without a trace. Disappearing along with the light was the projection of the world of laws, as well as the projections of the world of laws constructed by the countless tribulations stage powerhouses attached to the world of laws. For a time, apart from the countless stars and the endless void, only Luo Fan was left floating in the entire starry sky. Although those cultivator shadows looked like real cultivators, they were actually just a part of the projection of the world of laws. The projection of the world of laws was formed by Luo Fan's worldview of laws, so these cultivator shadows naturally belonged to Luo Fan's worldview of laws. Such an essence made them seem real, like real living beings, but in reality, they were nothing more than a phenomenon. Since they were phenomena, they could naturally be taken back and released at any time. In other words, as long as Luo Fan was willing, he could still release the mini cultivator shadows next time, and they could also easily do what they did this time. Before the abnormal could react, Luo Fan's figure flashed and directly arrived at the void that he had been paying attention to. After arriving, he raised his hand and pressed down on the void. In an instant, a brilliance that seemed to be alive erupted from his hand. Within this brilliance, there seemed to be countless layers of shadows stacked on top of each other. These shadows were naturally completely different from the shadows in the previous brilliance. The shadows in the previous brilliance seemed to be a chaotic combination of various angles superimposed on each other. This time, however, the shadows in the brilliance were completely different. There was only endless space in the shadows now, as if the interior of the brilliance was billions of times wider than it looked on the surface. This brilliance looked like the light of heaven and earth, but in fact, it was not the light of heaven and earth. In fact, this brilliance was a certain method extracted from the light of heaven and earth. It was some kind of dimensional division method. The reason why this dimensional division method was different from the dimensional division method attached to the concept God ability was very simple. And that was because this dimensional division method had integrated Luo Fan's understanding of many levels. In other words, the dimension that was separated by these dimension division methods was actually the kind of dimension that corresponded to the innumerable levels. In other words, the attributes that were divided by each dimension were also the attributes of the various levels contained in reality. Moreover, these dimensions were directly, closely related to the corresponding levels. Compared to the dimensional division that Luo Fan used in the past, it could borrow the power of other dimensions more efficiently. It was also because of these various characteristics that it became this brilliance that looked like the light of heaven and earth after gathering together. At this moment, under this brilliance, the void seemed to have been sliced by thousands of knives. In an instant, it was divided into billions of different levels of attributes, and they were absorbed into the countless dimensions. The countless levels of attributes gathered together, forming this void that seemed to be no different from any other void. However, after being divided into countless levels of attributes, its true essence was finally revealed. This location was closely related to the source of the abnormal willpower. It could be said that just this connection alone was enough to make this void have countless extraordinary performances. However, before this part of the void seemed so ordinary. This was clearly because of the various extraordinariness it possessed, because the various special structures and special combinations formed an extremely wonderful balance. Under this balance, the countless extraordinariness of the void itself was completely concealed, making it seem like an ordinary void. And now, after being divided into countless levels of attributes, this wonderful balance was naturally broken. The extraordinariness of the void was naturally revealed. At this moment, within the radiance that seemed to be alive, specks of light that were different from this radiance began to appear. The countless specks of light were in different dimensions, and their positions were also different. In the end, they intertwined in one place, looking like a miniature cosmic starry sky. Interesting. Seeing this, Luo Fan could not help but think of this. These specks of light truly existed in the starry sky of the universe. Even if they were attributes that had not been divided into countless levels, they still existed normally in this plane of reality. However, because their positions and structures were in line with some indescribable rules, they were able to conceal each other, and in the end, they were completely hidden in the plane of reality. Even Luo Fan could not see them. Until now, when Luo Fan directly divided them into countless levels of attributes and completely cut off the connection between them, their true appearance could be seen at this moment. At this moment, in that brilliance, every speck of light was actually the product of countless overlapping light shadows. In other words, every speck of light had actually been divided into countless layers of attributes by the countless dimensions. At this moment, what was seen was only the intertwining and overlapping layers of attributes of the light in the countless dimensions to form a whole. Their current position was actually the position of those lights in the plane of reality, and the distance and position between them was also the distance and position between them in the plane of reality. The distance and position between these rays of light clearly contained an extremely profound mystery. After all, ordinary mysteries could not stop Luo Fan's investigation. It could even be said that the distance and position of these lights actually contained some kind of cultivation essence that belonged to the seventh tribulation powerhouse. Only something of this level could make Luo Fan use such a method to see through it. If the fundamental goal was still the same as in the beginning, at this point Luo Fan could actually already stop. As long as he understood the structure of these starry lights, he would obviously be able to obtain what he originally wanted from this essence. However, it was obvious that after discovering the abnormal will, his goal was completely different. Now, what he wanted more was to clearly investigate the reason for the appearance of the abnormal will. Compared to the cultivation essence and cultivation essence of the seventh tribulation powerhouse, this abnormal reason that might be related to his own essence was obviously more important. Therefore, at this moment, he raised his hand and waved it in the air, and the brilliance that seemed to be alive began to wriggle rapidly. As it wriggled, the originally complete structure of starry lights was directly stirred up at this moment. Damn it! A roar of shock and anger reverberated in the entire universe at this moment. An unimaginably terrifying pressure directly pressed down on Luo Fan at this moment, making him feel as if the entire universe was directly pressing down on his heart at this moment. In the face of such a change, Luo Fan's expression did not change at all. With a slight thought, the brilliance that seemed to be alive continued to wriggle, and the countless scattered light spots began to gradually turn into a vortex at this moment. The vortex looked like a door to a whole new world. As the vortex appeared, a powerful will began to leak out from behind the vortex. That was the will that resonated with the entire universe at this moment. It was the will that was the source of the pressure that Luo Fan felt at this moment. This was obviously the abnormal will at this moment. In the face of such a change, Luo Fan let out a soft cry, and the brilliance that seemed to be alive suddenly separated from the middle, forming a halo. A halo that seemed to completely overlap with the vortex. In the middle of the halo, which was also the center of the vortex, the countless dimensions that had been separated once again fused together, revealing the normal plane of reality again. However, it was no longer the appearance of the void, but a door that led to a mysterious space-time. Just by looking at the door, one could see that it was an island. It was an island that Luo Fan was quite familiar with. That was the first island that Luo Fan found in the Void Ocean, the prison that the seventh tribulation powerhouse built. Of course, compared to the real prison, this island was still quite different. At the very least, there were no six tribulation powerhouses on it. Although there were countless living beings on it, they were only ordinary living beings, and none of them were transformed by a sixth tribulation powerhouse. The moment he saw the island, Luo Fan understood in his heart. The abnormal was not on the island, but it was the island itself. So that's how it is. At this moment, he had already understood a lot, and he unknowingly had a corresponding guess about the reason for the appearance of the abnormal will. At this moment, an unimaginable anger erupted from the island and rushed toward the door like a storm. In the blink of an eye, it gushed out of the door like a fountain and slammed into Luo Fan. Genius 1 second. Remember this website address. Mobile version. Chapter 3032. This kind of anger contained unimaginably terrifying power. If it was an ordinary seventh tribulation powerhouse, they would probably be infected by this emotion in an instant. Even if their mind did not collapse, they would definitely be in a daze for a while. However, it was clear that Luo Fan was not an ordinary seventh tribulation powerhouse. Just in terms of cultivation, he was already at the peak of the seventh tribulation powerhouse. Not to mention, he had too many means that ordinary seventh tribulation powerhouses did not have. At this moment, in the face of this terrifying anger, his heart only moved slightly. That anger had already been divided into countless layers of attributes by the countless dimensions that already existed in the surroundings. Before it came into contact with Luo Fan, it had already turned into a faint mist and directly flowed into the countless dimensions. It filled the space between the vortexes like traces of afterimages brought out by the vortexes. From a certain point of view, you should actually thank me for being able to be born, Luo Fan said with an inexplicable expression. By observing the origin of the abnormal will, he had more or less figured out the reason for the birth of the abnormal will. In fact, the reason for the birth of the abnormal will was very simple. At this moment, the owner of the essence, the incarnation of the seventh tribulation powerhouse with the appearance of a middle-aged woman, had completely sunk into the island that Luo Fan had constructed. The incarnation had sunk into the island. From a certain point of view, it could be said that it had lost all of its memories. In this way, it had naturally completely lost control of its original essence. This loss of control was due to the limitations of the 365 layers of the world that Luo Fan had constructed. However, it wasn't an ordinary loss, but an extremely thorough one. This degree of loss caused the existence that was originally the essence of the middle-aged woman to completely lose its master. Originally, this essence was extracted from the incarnation of the seven tribulation powerhouse. It was some sort of metaphysical, abstract existence. This existence could be said to be real, but it could also be said to be illusory. However, at the level of Luo Fan and the others, the gap between illusion and reality was actually more of a cognitive gap. Just like the projection of Luo Fan's world of laws, if the abnormal will didn't think it existed, then it wouldn't have been able to possess such incredible power and block the boundless, extraordinary flames. Once the abnormal will recognize the existence of the projection of the world of law, then the projection of the world of law would possess an unimaginably terrifying power. Not only would it be able to easily block the sea of fire, but it would also be able to trace the source of the abnormal will. It was the same for this essence. Because Luo Fan believed that this essence existed, and because the middle-aged woman also believed that this essence existed, this essence also existed. At this moment, the middle-aged woman had completely lost control over this essence. Her knowledge of whether this essence existed or not was naturally unable to affect this essence. In this way, the essence naturally began to change in the direction of illusory in certain details. Originally, there were two pillars supporting its existence, but now that one of the pillars had collapsed, this essence naturally couldn't be as stable as before. If this essence was an ordinary thing, it would naturally have no choice but to accept it. However, it was obvious that this was the essence of a seventh tribulation powerhouse. In fact, it had already met all the conditions to reconstruct a seventh tribulation powerhouse, but because of its essence, it couldn't integrate all the conditions to reconstruct a seventh tribulation powerhouse. At this moment, after losing a part of the pillar, this original shackle couldn't reconstruct the essence of a seven tribulation powerhouse, so it naturally couldn't be as complete as before. In this way, the various conditions would naturally begin to be put together. However, because there was still a pillar, this integration wasn't perfect, and the seventh tribulation powerhouse wasn't truly integrated. In the end, it only created this abnormal will that was like the will of the world. The island in front of him was obviously the one that Luo Fan had seen before, the one that the seven tribulation powerhouse had constructed. It was also the same appearance that Luo Fan had taken when he refined this essence back then. If both pillars collapsed at the same time, although this essence would eventually turn into nothingness and disappear completely, the island would definitely continue to transform before it turned into nothingness. In the end, it would directly reconstruct the seventh tribulation powerhouse's incarnation. However, it was obvious that the essence still had a pillar. This pillar naturally prevented the essence from completely collapsing, but it also prevented the evolution of the island from continuing. After all, the essence's essence hadn't completely collapsed. Therefore, in the end, it could only maintain the appearance of this island, which was the original appearance of the seventh tribulation powerhouse's incarnation. This was also why it was only an abnormal will, and not the seventh tribulation powerhouse. At this time, Luo Fan had already understood all of these secrets. At a glance, everything was already clear and crystal clear. If that's the case, it seems like I need to protect the essence as well. At this moment, such a thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind. Although the essence had only given birth to this abnormal will, the existence of this abnormal will had already caused the essence to break away from the seventh tribulation powerhouse's control. Moreover, because Luo Fan had been in this essence for too long, the abnormal will had already replaced the other pillar of the essence's existence. In other words, it had already replaced the essence's owner. The seventh tribulation powerhouse had used his own cognition to support the essence's existence. In this case, even if Luo Fan controlled his own cognition and completely erased the essence's existence from his own cognition, the essence would only disappear in front of Luo Fan's eyes. It would still exist, and even exist forever. In fact, if one day, this abnormal will could reorganize all of the essence's secrets, it would not be impossible to reconstruct a seventh tribulation powerhouse. Once a seventh tribulation powerhouse was reconstructed like this, it would be equivalent to the seventh tribulation powerhouse having an independent incarnation that completely knew all of its secrets and cultivation paths. In other words, it would be an enemy. Such an outcome would obviously be a disaster for any cultivator. For Luo Fan, it would not be any different. Thank you? What exactly do you know? At this moment, such words came from the island, and there was an inexplicable surprise in the voice. At this moment, the voice was no longer as strange and mysterious as before. Instead, it was a woman's voice. It was an extremely clear and melodious sound. Of course, it's your everything. Luo Fan smiled faintly at this moment. As he spoke, his heart moved slightly, and the many dimensions changed again. In an instant, the vortex formed by the specks of stars began to expand rapidly. In the blink of an eye, it had expanded to hundreds of millions of light years away. The small hole in the center of the vortex directly expanded into a vast void due to the changes. The island was no longer a shadow that could only be seen through the small hole. Instead, it seemed to have been pulled closer and actually appeared in front of Luo Fan, reaching a place where he could touch it. Although it seemed like Luo Fan had only made a slight movement just now, as if it was just a slight change in the dimension. In reality, to reach this step, the complexity of the changes was almost beyond the imagination of all living beings. If one really wanted to break it down and explain it in detail, perhaps even hundreds of millions of words might not be enough. Just the number of changes would probably need to be calculated in the hundreds of millions. Even the abnormal willpower could not understand such a complicated change in a short period of time. At this moment, when Luo Fan really appeared in front of her, her first reaction was that Luo Fan had stepped into that space-time and appeared in front of her. Of course, this was only her first feeling. After all, this was the world's willpower of this universe. In the end, she still quickly figured out that it was not Luo Fan who had stepped into that space-time, but he had been pulled out of that space-time. What exactly do you want to do? At this moment, a voice came from the island. This method of pulling her body out of the space-time where she resided had clearly made the island, or rather, the abnormal willpower, clearly feel the huge gap between her and Luo Fan. After clearly understanding how huge the gap between them was, she naturally would not limit the solution to the problem to battle. At this moment, Luo Fan only smiled faintly and said, "I just want to figure out how to prevent you from appearing. That's all." At this moment, the abnormal willpower trembled violently, as if an indescribable fear had enveloped her at this moment. "Why? What effect does my appearance have on you? Why do you want to kill me?" The abnormal willpower roared angrily, and her body flickered with light. At this moment, the entire universe began to tremble violently, and endless brilliance began to gradually appear in every inch of the void of the entire universe and above every star. An indescribable pressure appeared in Luo Fan's heart at this moment. This feeling was as if a catastrophe was about to befall them. You want to die with me? At this moment, Luo Fan frowned and said faintly at this moment, since you want to kill me, do you think I should take the initiative to stretch my neck out? The abnormal willpower said angrily. You know, I'm just an avatar here. Even if you die with me here, my main body will not suffer any loss, Luo Fan said. The abnormal willpower trembled for a moment, but in the end she still roared. Even so, I will drag your incarnation down with me. It's better than being killed by you directly. Of course, although this was what he said, the indescribable pressure in Luo Fan's heart was still greatly reduced in an instant. Obviously, what Luo Fan said was not completely useless. After all, killing the enemy's avatar, which was not an independent avatar, was not a loss to the enemy at all. Compared to being killed by the enemy directly, it was actually only a little better. Obviously, no one would be willing to sacrifice their own life for this little bit of result unless it was absolutely necessary. Moreover, who said that I want to kill you? I just want to know how to stop you from appearing, Luo Fan said faintly at this moment. This made the abnormal willpower pause slightly. If you want to stop me from appearing, doesn't that mean you want to kill me? She asked doubtfully. At this moment, Luo Fan clearly had an absolute advantage. Even if she controlled everything in the universe, her main body was already standing in front of Luo Fan. Distant waters could not quench a nearby fire. Even if she controlled the power of the entire universe and could cause a certain degree of threat to Luo Fan, before these powers could take effect, Luo Fan's methods would directly fall on her main body. Therefore, it could be said that her life was completely in the hands of Luo Fan at this moment. Under such circumstances, she could not think of any reason for Luo Fan to lie to her. What does it matter to me whether you exist or not? On the contrary, your appearance is actually more advantageous to me. After all, through you, I can easily understand things that would normally take a lot of time to integrate, Luo Fan said faintly. So that's how it is. I understand now. So you're trying to prevent your own nature from giving birth to an existence like me. The abnormal willpower finally completely relaxed at this moment. In fact, she should have been able to guess Luo Fan's true intentions long ago when Luo Fan opened his mouth. However, because this matter concerned her life and Luo Fan's previous behavior was so against her, she could not calm down and think about it, resulting in such a misunderstanding just now. At this moment, when Luo Fan said that he did not want her life, she finally really relaxed. Her mind regained its calmness, and her rationality returned. Only then did she really think clearly about the answer that she should have thought through a long time ago. At this moment, the entire universe began to gradually dim, and the original flickering light in the sky also completely dissipated. And the pressure in Luo Fan's heart also completely disappeared at this moment. Everything returned to its original state, as if nothing had happened. Genius 1 second remember website address. Mobile version. Chapter 3034. Taoist Hongqua quickly suppressed the feeling of ascension. Although ascension was what he pursued as a disciple of the Tao Master, he did not only pursue ascension. Continuing to strengthen his foundation as a sixth tribulation expert in the sixth level of the road to Tao Master was also another pursuit of his. In fact, it was even more resolute than ascending to a higher realm. Under such circumstances, how could he hastily ascend just because he felt the hope of ascension? At that moment, he put all these feelings about ascension to the back of his mind and once again devoted himself to Luo Fan's lecture. He experienced the various principles and mysteries contained in it, which he had previously spent countless efforts to explore. This process of preaching lasted for several years. One day after a few years, Luo Fan finally stopped preaching and sighed, saying, "That's all I have learned. I hope it will be of help to you." Taoist Hong Kuo came back to his senses. After staring blankly for a while, he solemnly bowed to Luo Fan and said, "Thank you, Taoist brother, for lecturing me. Without Taoist brother's lecture, I'm afraid it would have taken me hundreds of millions of years to achieve this breakthrough. Taoist brother's kindness. Hong Kuo will always remember it. As he spoke, he had already changed the way he addressed Luo Fan. Obviously, Luo Fan's position in his heart was very different from before. Luo Fan only smiled and said, "Fellow Taoist is too serious. This is only a slight effort. Compared to the technique that fellow Taoist bestowed, this is nothing." Taoist Hong Kuo stood up and heard Luo Fan's words. His expression changed slightly, and he seemed to be a little ashamed. He said, "In fact, that method is only a small part of a complete method. Because I'm only an incarnation, I can't carry the complete method, so I can only pass this small part to you. Compared to what you have given me, it's really insignificant. How about this? I'll let my original body come over and personally pass the method to you." Luo Fan said, "Taoist brother, rest assured, I already know that the method is only a small part. However, I only need a small portion of it. With that small part of the technique, it's equivalent to having the complete technique. In fact, I've already deduced a complete technique that belongs solely to me from that small portion, so I don't need your complete technique anymore." Taoist Hong Kuo was shocked when he heard that. That technique, or rather, how exquisite that technique was, could be seen from the fact that even the incarnation of an existence at his level could not withstand it. But now Luo Fan was able to deduce the entire technique from a small part of it. This ability was as unbelievable as deducing the structure of the entire universe from a grain of sand. To be able to do this, Luo Fan's intelligence and realm had clearly risen to a level that was completely incomprehensible to him. At this moment, he felt as if he had never known Luo Fan, and all his previous impressions of Luo Fan seemed to be his own imagination. Suddenly, his heart skipped a beat, and he suddenly said, "Taoist brother, could it be that you're going against the flow?" Luo Fan was slightly stunned, and then he said with a smile, "Taoist brother, why do you say so?" Taoist brother's realm is definitely beyond the 6 tribulations level. For an expert of this level, if he were to take the right path, it would be impossible for him to become a Tao master below level 6. Only by taking the legendary against the flow can he not be limited by the Tao master path, and then he could become a Tao master below level 6. Taoist brother, you just ascended to this level not long ago, so I have such a judgment. Taoist Hong Kuo looked at Luo Fan with admiration and worry. Although he was asking, in fact, he was almost convinced that Luo Fan was going against the flow. After all, he was a disciple of the Tao Master. As a disciple of the Tao Master, his knowledge would not be bad. At a lower level, the fact that Luo Fan took the against the flow had been seen by many practitioners. As a disciple of the Tao Master at the peak of the 6 tribulations level, it was not surprising that Taoist Hong Kuo could see that Luo Fan was going against the flow after such a long time. And his expression after seeing that Luo Fan was going against the flow was even more reasonable. There was no need to say more about his admiration. The against the flow had always existed only in legends. Taoist Hong Kuo had been cultivating for billions of years, but he had never seen any practitioner step into such a path. That was just hearsay, and it was just a legend. Although he had heard of the existence of such a cultivation path from the Tao Master, at the same time, he also knew from the Tao Master how difficult it was to go against the flow and how great the risk was. According to the ratio, among billions of experts in the tribulation stage who took the against the flow, there might be one who could become a true sage. And if the against the flow was taken into account, among billions of experts in the tribulation stage who took the against the flow, there might not be one true sage. Almost all the experts in the tribulation stage who took the against the flow died a violent death after 1 or 2 tribulations. Their souls were scattered, and they would never be able to reincarnate. This ratio was given by the true sage. According to the true sage, this ratio was given to make it easier for them to understand. It only represented the difference in difficulty between the 2 paths, but it did not mean that the ratio was really like this. It was precisely because the probability of becoming a sage by taking the against the flow was so small that the against the flow was abandoned by more and more great worlds. Of course, it was also because it was abandoned that it was called the against the flow. Otherwise, it would be obvious who was the against the flow among different cultivation methods. Because he was clear about this, Taoist Hong Kua naturally admired Luo Fan, who dared to take the against the flow and had already taken the against the flow. Naturally, there was no need to mention worry. The risk of going against the flow of time was so great. Every single tribulation was equivalent to a test with no chance of survival. Even the process of cultivation between the tribulations was filled with countless risks. It went without saying how dangerous it was to take such a path. Now, that Taoist Hong Kua was so grateful to Luo Fan. How could he not be worried about Luo Fan taking the against the flow? Luo Fan just smiled and said, as expected of a disciple of the Tao Master, "Your knowledge is extraordinary." That's right, I should be taking the against the flow. However, in my opinion, maybe I'm the against the flow. Taoist Hong Kua just sighed helplessly at this time. He had a little hope before, but now that he heard Luo Fan admit it, he finally completely believed that Luo Fan was taking the against the flow. There was no longer any hope in his heart. Maybe. Master once said that the against the flow and the against the flow are not superior or inferior. Compared with the against the flow has the advantage of the against the flow. Although the probability of becoming a Tao Master is hundreds of millions of times higher than that of the against the flow, it is not because this against the flow is so much better than the against the flow. It is because the cultivators who take the against the flow generally have a survival time of hundreds of millions of times to pursue the ultimate goal. Because of such a long time of cultivation, the number of people who become Tao Masters is naturally much more than that of the against the flow. In contrast, the advantage of the against the flow is that it is faster. It can be said that, in fact, it is equivalent to compressing the cultivation process of the against the flow into a very short period of time. In this way, the final danger encountered will naturally be many times more than that of the against the flow. Coupled with the repeated pressure from the great tribulations, the chances of going against the flow of time to achieve Tao became so small. Therefore, from a certain point of view, there is not much difference between the against the flow and the against the flow. At this time, Taoist Hong Kua spoke one by one about the against the flow and the against the flow that he had heard from his master. Hearing this, Luo Fan's face became serious. The perspective of this passage was from a commanding position. It was almost an absolute, overlooking view of the cultivation below the true divine level. It clearly described the similarities and differences between the right path and the wrong path, making Luo Fan feel that most of the fog that was originally covering his eyes had dissipated in an instant. For a long time, he almost relied on himself to cultivate. When he encountered a bottleneck and could not find the direction, he would study and test from other cultivators. If there was no other way, he would search from the heaven and earth, from the state of chaos. If that did not work, he would rely on the tribulation after tribulation to give himself inspiration. In this way, it could be said that he had almost stumbled to get to where he was today. As for the fundamental path of cultivation, as well as the so-called against the flow, he only knew about it after coming to the great Tao Master world and coming into contact with the many experts who had entered the tribulation on the Tao Master path. In the past, he did not even know that there was a difference between against the flow and the against the flow. For a long time, he had even thought that cultivation was just like what he had done. From the very beginning, he had begun to sort out his own worldview, and then he had perfected his worldview over and over again in the process of cultivation. There was only one way to perfect his worldview. It was not until he came to the great Tao Master world that he realized that this method was actually a method that went against the flow in the eyes of other cultivators. The real mainstream method of cultivation was actually to gather one's own unique concept bit by bit. One by one, the concept would be perfected and the concept would be improved. In this way, it would continue to accumulate and converge, and finally, In the end, when the conditions were right, it would naturally converge into a unique and complete worldview. At the same time, it would also naturally raise the cultivator's cultivation realm to the true divine level. In fact, if there was a choice, Luo Fan's heart was actually inclined to this against the flow. After all, although such a path was extremely complicated and seemed to be endless, even the most optimistic prediction would definitely require more than a trillion years to complete the cultivation. However, this kind of cultivation process was ultimately safer. Not only did he not have to go through the tribulation again and again, but he also had the experience of countless predecessors in front of him. As long as he was willing, he could obtain guidance from countless predecessors. However, unfortunately, when Luo Fan knew the difference between the against the flow and the against the flow, he could no longer turn back. At that time, he had already overcome the tribulation and truly established his own path. Moreover, his worldview had already been completely established. His worldview had already been completely integrated with him and could no longer be separated. Naturally, it could no longer be like the against the flow, where one Tao concept after another could be perfected and perfected. Therefore, the only choice he could make was the against the flow. More importantly, from that moment on, his heart had already truly acknowledged the path of going against the flow. He felt that the path of going against the flow was his true path, and that the way of moving forward on the path of going against the flow was the way of moving forward that his heart desired, until now. When he heard the words of the true divine from Taoist Hongqua's mouth, he truly had a macroscopic understanding of the similarities and differences between the against the flow and the against the flow. He truly knew why the right path was the right path, and the wrong path was the wrong path. For a moment, he felt that his state of mind had suddenly become open. Although it was not to the extent that he would immediately have an epiphany and his cultivation realm would suddenly improve greatly. However, at the very least, the oppressive feeling that was suppressing his heart had completely disappeared. If that's the case, perhaps at the initial stage of the state of chaos, the against the flow is the true mainstream path. At this time, Luo Fan let out a long breath and said, Taoist Hongqua was a little ashamed and said, "This I don't know." At that time, Master only mentioned the against the flow and against the flow, but did not further elaborate. We didn't dare to ask, so we just let it go. If I had known that I would meet you, I would have definitely asked for your guidance. Luo Fan smiled faintly and said, "You must be joking, Taoist friend. I'm already extremely satisfied to be able to hear this. How can I dare to hope for more?" Of course, he knew that the Tao master behind Taoist Hongqua had actually mentioned the against and against the flow, which was actually an unexpected gain for him. After all, the Tao master obviously did not intend to let his disciple go against the flow. At most, he talked about the against the flow to broaden his disciple's horizons, so that in the future, he would not be unable to understand the existence of the against the flow. Under such circumstances, how could he explain the situation of the against the flow? If he explained it too clearly, what if his disciple was tempted and actually overestimated his own ability to challenge the against the flow? Wouldn't that be going against his plan? With such a thought, if Taoist Hongqua asked about the against the flow, it might make the Tao master suspect that he had overestimated his own ability. Taoist Hongqua was still ashamed and felt that he did not help Luo Fan and felt that he had let him down. Chapter 30-35. After knowing that Luo Fan was walking on the inverse path, Taoist Hongqua no longer had any doubts as to why Luo Fan could have such a deep understanding of the void ocean layer in such a short period of time. At this time, he was trying hard to dig out the memories in his heart, trying to find out what his master had said about the inverse path. Taoist Hongqua was a disciple of the Tao master, but this did not mean that he had a close relationship with the Tao master. The number of disciples of the Tao master on the path of the Tao master could be calculated in the trillions. How could so many disciples of the Tao master have a close relationship with the Tao master? In fact, except for a small number of disciples of the Tao master, almost all of the disciples of the Tao master had already broken contact with the Tao master. Just like Taoist Hongqua, he was indeed a disciple of the Tao master, and he had indeed been advised by the Tao master. However, That was something that happened billions of trillions of years ago. Before him, his master had already taken in billions and trillions of disciples. After him, his master had also taken in billions and trillions of disciples. Although, when he was advised by his master, he only had a few disciples. However, these few disciples were only one of the billions of disciples that his master had accepted in the past billions of years. In this way, he was no longer qualified to mention the name of the Tao Master. It was even more impossible to contact the Tao Master. Therefore, at this time, even if he wanted to be thick-skinned and ask the Tao Master about the inverse path, he could no longer find any way. Under such circumstances, if he wanted to help Luo Fan, of course, he could only dig out his own memories and search for all the words he had heard when he was advised by the Tao Master. Although he had been warned by the Tao Master for billions of trillions of years, the Tao Master had not given him any advice. However, from the first time he met the Tao Master to the last time he met the Tao Master, he clearly remembered every detail of the Tao Master's words, except for those that he could not remember or understand. Now that he thought about it, it still felt like he was there. When the Tao Master taught his disciple, it was not like how ordinary cultivators taught their disciples. The number of times he personally met his disciple was very few. Only very occasionally, when he felt that it was necessary, would he personally summon his disciples. The reason was very simple. For those who were below the Tao Master level, just seeing their figures and hearing their voices would bring unimaginable pressure to them. This kind of pressure, once in a while, would bring great benefits to cultivators below the Tao Master level. They might be able to comprehend some higher mysteries from it. However, if it happened too many times, it would be a disaster for cultivators below the Tao Master level. After a few times, it might even twist the disciple's will and path of cultivation. In that case, the disciple would naturally be crippled. Therefore, although there were various ways for the Tao Master to teach his disciple, there was a basic principle. He would not appear in front of his disciple in person. Some Tao Masters would use incarnations that reduced their own strength to 1 in a trillion to teach their disciples. 1 in a trillion Tao Masters was also 1 in a trillion true sage. Although their strength was far stronger than a 9 tribulation expert, they obviously did not have as strong a true sage level occult as a true sage. As long as it was restrained enough, it was something that ordinary cultivators could bear. However, some Tao Masters directly taught their disciples through some carriers, and with the help of these carriers, they would filter the true sage mysteries contained in their bodies. Some Tao Masters used some puppets to teach their disciples, and so on and so forth. There were many kinds of methods. Hong Kuo's master used the first method to teach his disciple with an incarnation that had been reduced to 1 in a trillion. Although such an incarnation had been reduced to 1 in a trillion, it was still the incarnation of a true sage after all, and it also contained endless mysteries. If it had been billions of years ago, when Hong Kuo had not completely cut off his connection with the Tao Master, as long as he recalled the memory of the Tao Master teaching him, the incarnation of the Tao Master would naturally respond and be able to directly teach him in the memory. That was to say, at that time, if Hong Kuo wanted to know more about the mystery of the inverse path, he could directly ask the incarnation of the Tao Master in his memory. And the incarnation of the Tao Master would definitely be able to teach him and tell him directly what he wanted to know, just like the real incarnation of the Tao Master. This was a kind of insignificant power that the Tao Master had. However, it was obvious that that was only in the past. After billions of trillions of years, the situation had completely changed. In fact, when Hong Kuo had stepped onto the Tao Master path, he was already considered to have finished his apprenticeship. From then on, the connection between him and the Tao Master had almost been completely cut off. After the connection was completely cut off, in his memory, the Tao Master had already become a blur. Even though the Tao Master had been exhorting him to his face, even though the Tao Master's incarnation had been with him for a long time, his memory of the Tao Master's incarnation had become blurred after he stepped onto the Tao Master's path. Although he could clearly remember every word that the Tao Master had said, everything that the Tao Master had done to him, and even every detail that had happened in the process of getting along with the incarnation of the Tao Master. However, the body of the Tao Master had already become a blur in his heart. Even the body had become blurred, so it was naturally impossible to ask the incarnation of the Tao Master in his memory to obtain new principles. In this situation, it seemed that the Tao Master was quite merciless. After finishing his apprenticeship, he even blurred the memory of the incarnation of the Tao Master. But in fact, this could be said to be the Tao Master's kindness and the Tao Master's expectations for the Tao Master's disciples. The level of the Tao Master was really too high. It was so high that even a trace of the existence related to the Tao Master's existence could have a shocking impact on the existence below the Tao Master. Under such circumstances, if the Tao Master's disciples retained their memories of the Tao Master, it would be equivalent to a part of the Tao Master's projection remaining in the other party's memory. What kind of concept was a part of the Tao Master's projection? It was almost equivalent to a true sage leaving a part of himself in the other party's memory. The impact of this remnant on the cultivator was so great that ordinary creatures could not imagine it at all. It could be said that as long as it existed, it would always have an extremely deep impact on the cultivator. The Tao Master's cultivation path, the Tao Master's understanding of cultivation, the world, the state of chaos, and even the primordial chaos before the state of chaos would inevitably seep out from the projection and gradually contaminate the cultivator's memory and mind. In the end, it would completely distort the cultivator and cause the cultivator to unknowingly lose his own cultivation path. Once a cultivator lost his or her own path of cultivation, his or her future would be completely cut off. Without his own cultivation path, no matter how many resources he had, how much guidance he could get, and how many opportunities he could get, his final achievement would at most be a 9 tribulations expert. Perhaps such an existence was already an unfathomable achievement for ordinary living beings. However, what was the point for a true sage? As long as a 9 tribulations expert or a true sage was willing, they could easily create hundreds of millions of names. Therefore, if one wanted to let one's disciple have a future, it was obvious that one should completely erase all the memories of oneself in the disciple's heart. Only in this way could one completely eliminate the distortion of one's own cultivation path on the disciple's cultivation path. This was also the fundamental reason why the disciples of the Tao Master would directly erase all the memories of the Tao Master, whether it was the real body or the incarnation, after stepping onto the Tao Master's path. It could be said that it was because the Tao Master had expectations for them. He hoped that they could become true sages and step into the realm that they were at. As for the reason why these memories would only disappear completely after they stepped onto the Tao Master's path, but before that, they were allowed to retain these memories, the reason was even simpler. Obviously, it was because, for the Tao Master before stepping onto the Tao Master's path, they were still carrying out basic cultivation. They were still children and still needed guidance from the Tao Master. I can't find it all. It's a pity that I could directly ask the Master in my memory in the past, but now I can't do it all. Taoist Hongqua went through all the guidance he had heard in the process of getting along with the Master. In the end, he could only sigh helplessly and look even more ashamed. Luo Fan did not delve into what Taoist Hongqua meant when he said that he could ask the Tao Master in his memory. At this time, he just smiled and said, "Taoist friend, you don't have to worry about it. I've already stepped onto the Tao Master's path. Whether I have the Tao Master's guidance or not, I won't change. In fact, it doesn't matter whether I know or not." Taoist Hongqua still did not relax, and his expression was still full of shame. For him, the benefits that Luo Fan had given him this time were so great that he would feel extremely uneasy if he could not repay it. Although what he had said before was heard from the Tao Master, in fact, it was just a general summary of the Tao Master's path and the Tao Master's path. He did not think that it would be of much help to Luo Fan. When Luo Fan said that he was satisfied, he naturally took it as a comfort, but he did not think that it was true. "Hey, I know. Although I don't know much, I have quite a few good seniors and juniors. Perhaps they might know more." Suddenly, Taoist Hongqua's eyes lit up. As he spoke, he directly closed his eyes, as if he was about to do something. Slightly stunned, Luo Fan was about to raise his hand to stop him. Seeing that the Taoist Hongqua finally began to move, he could only sigh and stop. At this time, the Taoist Hongqua here was only his incarnation, and his real body was obviously still in his own heavens. At this time, the incarnation closed its eyes, but it was not the incarnation that was taking action, but his real body that was taking action. By closing his eyes, he was just concentrating his energy to let his real body do something. As an existence at the peak of the six tribulations, it was difficult for even his incarnation to take action, which was enough to show how much his real body knew at this time. Even Luo Fan suspected that the senior brothers he was trying to contact might not be on the sixth floor of the Tao Master's path. If they were on the sixth floor, it should not be so difficult to contact them, and he did not even need to use the energy of his incarnation. Taoist Hongqua closed his eyes to contact them, and half a year had passed. For Luo Fan, this period of time was naturally nothing. Not to mention half a year, even 10,000, 100,000, 1 million, or 10 million years were not too long for him. Therefore, in such a short period of time, he naturally would not feel anxious or impatient. Of course, although he was not anxious because of the passing of half a year, it did not mean that he was just waiting here for half a year. In fact, during this half a year, he had carefully sculpted this Taoist rite and made the dimension of this Taoist rite sublimate again and again. Now, the dimension of this Taoist rite had directly turned into a vast and boundless world, and it had even begun to give birth to creatures that belonged to this world. Of course, it was only half a year after all, and these creatures were still muddle-headed. It was ultimately impossible for them to really establish a civilization and give birth to some kind of cultivation way. At least, it was impossible when Luo Fan did not completely accelerate the evolution of this world, because this mind incarnation itself was the carrier of communication between his heavens and the void ocean. During this half a year, this mind incarnation had unknowingly undergone various inexplicable transformations. At this time, it seemed to be much stronger than before, and its understanding of the void ocean had unknowingly risen to another level. At this time, if he wanted to talk about the mysteries of this void ocean to Taoist Hongqua again, he might be able to find more new things to talk about. Compared to the changes in his mind incarnation, the changes in his heavens were also quite significant. At this moment, he faintly felt that his heavens seemed to be gradually dividing, as if there was a parallel existence behind this heavens that was slowly being born. Genius 1 Second Remember website. Mobile version. Chapter 3036. The feeling of an existence similar to Ping Xin being born behind the heavens was extremely mysterious. It was as if the heavens were becoming more and more complete. Is this the cultivation direction of the sixth level of the Tao Master's path? At this moment, Luo Fan could not help but think to himself. At first glance, the changes in the heavens did not seem to have anything to do with the sixth level of the Tao Master's path. But with a little inference, one would find that the changes in the heavens were actually faintly related to the situation of the ocean of nothingness in the sixth level of the Tao Master's path. The ocean of nothingness was divided into countless layers in a way that Luo Fan could not imagine. Behind each layer of the ocean of nothingness existed another layer of the ocean of nothingness. To a certain extent, this situation was extremely similar to the changes that had occurred in Luo Fan's heavens. Behind the heavens, another layer was also being born, similar to the existence of the heavens. Such a mutual response made it difficult for Luo Fan not to connect this change with the cultivation direction of the sixth level of the Tao Master's path. However, Luo Fan suddenly felt a little uncertain in his heart. After all, his current understanding of the sixth level of the Tao Master's path was no longer just based on his own exploration. He had already heard a lot about the cultivation methods of the various cultivators in the sixth level of the Tao Master's path from Taoist Hongqua, who was a disciple of the Tao Master's path. Although he did not describe all the mysteries of cultivation, he still revealed a lot of changes in the cultivator's respective heavens in the process of communication. From the description, it was clear that the evolution of the heavens of ordinary six tribulation experts was not the same as the evolution of Luo Fan's heavens. Among them, there was no other heavens that were similar to the ocean of nothingness. This situation was obviously a unique evolution of Luo Fan's own heavens. Under such circumstances, no matter how confident he was, Luo Fan could not possibly believe that his cultivation direction was correct and that the other six tribulation expert cultivation direction was completely wrong. That was why he was so uncertain whether this was the cultivation direction of the sixth level of the Tao Master's path. Just as Luo Fan was thinking to himself, there was finally a change in Taoist Hongqua. He seemed to have woken up from a deep slumber. The aura on his body gradually became lively, and his eyes became focused again. He still looked quite ashamed. Although it was a little less than before, it was still in the category of shame. Seeing this, Luo Fan had a general understanding of what Taoist Hongqua had gained in the past 6 months. Obviously, Taoist Hongqua had gained something from consulting other senior and junior brothers over the past 6 months. However, these gains were obviously not much. At least, it was not enough to satisfy Taoist Hongqua. I'm really ashamed. Although I've tried my best to contact other disciples, I only got a few words from Master in the end. Taoist Hongqua bowed to Luo Fan and sighed. Hearing this, Luo Fan's mind incarnation smiled and said, "Sorry to trouble you, Taoist friend. You've been so busy for my matter." Taoist Hongqua waved his hand again and again to express his shame. However, he did not continue to dwell on this for too long. Obviously, for Luo Fan, what was more important was the Tao Master's words about the retrograde path. Other things were obviously secondary at this time. Master once told one of my senior brothers that the path of going against the flow was actually the mainstream of cultivation when the primal chaos was first formed. At that time, the current path of going against the flow was the true path of going against the flow, and the current path of going against the flow was instead the path of going against the flow. This is also the fundamental reason why the realm division of experts in the tribulation realm is called tribulation. It is precisely because a long time ago, it was orthodox and mainstream to pass the Great Tribulation to improve the realm. So this level of the realm is called tribulation. Taoist Hongqua said. Then, he didn't stop and continued. Master once told another senior of mine that tribulations are the key to going against the flow of time. It seems that the focus of cultivation should be placed on the Great Tribulation. Speaking of this, he was quite puzzled. For this sentence, my senior brother pondered for hundreds of millions of years, but still couldn't figure out what it meant. There were obviously two explanations for that sentence. The first was that for the retrograde path, tribulation was extremely difficult, and it was a difficulty that could only be overcome by putting all the focus of cultivation on preparing to deal with it. The second explanation was that the cultivation in the Great Tribulation was the real key cultivation, and the cultivation outside the Great Tribulation was secondary. With regard to these two possibilities, it was obvious that the disciple who heard the Tao Master's words couldn't distinguish them at all. He didn't know which situation the Tao Master was trying to express. As for Taoist Hongqua, there was no need to say more. At this time, he was just passing on the sentence, and he even began to think about the meaning of this sentence. Under such circumstances, his understanding of this sentence was naturally more superficial. Perhaps he hadn't even thought of the possibility of the second explanation. At this time, when Luo Fan heard this sentence, he only felt that his vision was broadened, and his mind suddenly became clearer than ever. Based on his experience of going through 7 great tribulations, there was no need to explain what this sentence meant at all. Apart from the second kind of great tribulation, there was no other possibility. The cultivation in the Great Tribulation is the key, and the cultivation outside the Great Tribulation is secondary. It's just a side issue. This sentence echoed in his heart, and he only felt that the direction of cultivation that he was originally confused about suddenly became extremely clear at this time. Since he encountered the first Great Tribulation, Each of his great tribulation seemed to be extremely long, and the experience in each great tribulation was also beyond imagination. It could be said that each great tribulation was equivalent to a brand new place of cultivation for him. There were a few times when he even stayed in the great tribulation for hundreds of millions of years. All along, he felt that no matter where he was, it did not make any difference to him. So he did not have any imbalanced mentality because of this. However, now that he heard Taoist Hong Kuo's word from the true sage, he just realized that perhaps he did not pay enough attention to the process of cultivation in the Great Tribulation. Perhaps he had spent too much energy outside the Great Tribulation. Perhaps he should have stayed in the Great Tribulation for a longer time and spent more energy on the various principles and mysteries revealed in the Great Tribulation. With this thought, his expression could not help but change slightly. At this time, Taoist Hong Kuo was shocked, and he said, "Brother, what's wrong? Did I say something wrong?" Luo Fan came back to his senses, smiled, and said, "No, you did not say anything wrong. On the contrary, what fellow Taoist has said is irreplaceable guidance for my cultivation. If I become successful in the future, what you said today will definitely be extremely important." Hearing this, Taoist Hong Kuo heaved a sigh of relief. Although he did not know what Luo Fan had comprehended, as long as what he said was helpful to Luo Fan, then his goal would be achieved. "Apart from this, did you find out anything else?" Luo Fan asked at this time. Although he did not have much expectations for the Tao Master's words, after hearing Taoist Hong Kuo's words continuously, Luo Fan instead had more expectations for the Tao Master's words. Perhaps the Tao Master had more understanding of the path of retrogression and might have more inspiration for him. "Sorry, I only have these 2 sentences," Taoist Hong Kuo said shamefully. Although Luo Fan had expected this, he was still a little disappointed to hear this at this time. Of course, he naturally would not show this disappointment too obviously. After all, it was already very rare for Taoist Hong Kuo to bring him these gains. It was naturally better to have more. However, if there was no more, he could not be blamed. "Why do you need to apologize? I was greedy." Luo Fan smiled. With that, he looked solemn and bowed to Taoist Hong Kuo, thanking him very solemnly for sharing the Tao Master's words about the path of retrogression. Taoist Hong Kuo naturally understood that Luo Fan was sincere when he expressed his gratitude so solemnly. He finally relaxed completely and said with a smile, "As long as it is of some help to Tao brother, it's fine. I was worried that these things would be of no use to Tao brother." How could it be? Even if it is just a few words, it is the words of a supreme existence like the Tao Master. It definitely contains endless mysteries. If I dare to say that it is of no use to me, it would only show that I am shallow. Luo Fan also smiled. Then, the atmosphere between them became much more relaxed. Whether it was Luo Fan or Taoist Hong Kuo, it was the same. It was true that they felt indebted to each other and had a closer connection with each other. However, this state of feeling indebted to each other was obviously not a healthy state of mind for communication. People with such a mentality would definitely have obstacles in the process of communicating with others and would not be able to act freely. Just like Taoist Hong Kuo previously. Now, after Luo Fan solemnly expressed that he had made up for what he felt indebted to him, he finally truly relaxed and regained his initial freedom. With this mentality, the communication between him and Luo Fan naturally became smoother. After more than half a year, Luo Fan had a deeper understanding of this layer of the nothingness ocean. At this time, he naturally would not be polite to Taoist Hong Kuo, so he shared his understanding one by one. As for Luo Fan's preaching, Taoist Hong Kuo listened with delight. However, he did not just listen to Luo Fan's preaching like before. During the process, he constantly shared his various thoughts and various inspirations. Compared to what Luo Fan had preached, this content was naturally much more crude. After all, there was a huge gap between their cultivation realms. However, this did not mean that what he said was completely useless to Luo Fan. On the contrary, the content of what he said was a great inspiration for Luo Fan. After all, no matter what, Taoist Hongqua, was an expert at the peak of the six tribulations, and he had also cultivated on the sixth layer of the Tao Master's path for hundreds of millions of years. Under such circumstances, his familiarity with the sixth layer of the Tao Master's path was naturally far better than Luo Fan's. The consequence of this familiarity was that his thoughts were far more grounded than Luo Fan's, and they were connected to the sixth layer of the Tao Master's path. This kind of grounding made the thoughts and inspirations he put forward touch on many of the blind spots in Luo Fan's previous thinking. For Luo Fan, this made up for the blind spots that he could not touch. For him, the benefits were self-evident. Through this kind of communication, both Luo Fan and Taoist Hongqua felt that they had gained a lot. They felt that they were constantly comprehending things that they could not comprehend before. Time passed slowly in this process. Unknowingly, dozens of years had passed. During these decades, Luo Fan's mind incarnation did not care about anything else at all. He only focused on communicating with Taoist Hongqua. Due to the passage of time and the increasing interaction between his heavens and the ocean of nothingness, Luo Fan's understanding of the ocean of nothingness also became deeper and deeper. As a result, after a period of time, Luo Fan was able to put forward some things that he could not bring up before, and he had a deeper understanding of the void ocean. This made Taoist Hongqua unconsciously feel that Luo Fan was an incomparably huge treasure. No matter how much he dug, he would not be able to dig to the bottom. With this feeling, his respect and admiration for Luo Fan grew stronger as time went by. From time to time, he would sigh in his heart, "No wonder Brother Luo Fan can go against the flow to this point. His wisdom is indeed not something I can compare with." The more it was like this, the more Taoist Hongqua felt pity for Luo Fan. No matter how much he admired Luo Fan and how extraordinary Luo Fan's wisdom was, he was still a disciple of the true sage. In the end, he still believed in the judgment of the Tao Master. The Tao Master had said that the chance of attaining the Tao by going against the flow was billions of times less than the chance of attaining the Tao by going against the flow. No matter how much he felt that Luo Fan was extraordinary, he could not deceive himself into believing that Luo Fan was 1 in a trillion. Therefore, in his heart, Luo Fan had obviously set foot on a path of no return. He was only a few steps away from a dead end. With this thought, how could he not feel pity for Luo Fan?